Good morning, everyone, and welcome back for day 2 of our discussion on the RA Enhancements Draft Final Proposal and 6th Revised Straw Proposal. My name is Isabella Nicosia, representing ISO Stakeholder Affairs, and I'll be facilitating the web conference today. I'm also joined on the line by our 3 presenters, Lauren Carr, Carl Musin, and Milos Bosnek, all from Infrastructure and Regulatory Policy. There are also a few other subject matter experts on the line available to answer questions as they come up. So we did post some updated presentations. We moved some agenda items around to fit in the 2 items that we didn't get to yesterday. So those updated presentations are available on the initiative webpage. Today's call is being recorded, and the recording is for informational and convenience purposes only. Any related transcriptions should not be reprinted without the ISO's permission. We will be taking questions throughout the call today, and you can enter the question queue at any time by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Just a reminder to please introduce yourself before asking your question. So the agenda for today, we are going to start off with some continued discussion on UCAP from yesterday. So Lauren will kick us off with that. And then we'll move into planned outage process enhancements from Carl, and then wrap up today with RA imports from Milos and must offer obligations from Lauren. So with that, I will hand it over to Lauren, and we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thanks, Isabella, and good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Before I get into our content and the slides, I did want to just thank everybody for the discussion yesterday. We had a lot of good questions and comments on the UCAP topic, but I know there may be still some outstanding questions or comments that we didn't get to. We sort of got a little tight on time towards the end there. We're talking about UCAP counting for imports and hybrids and that topic. So just wanted to let folks know that if there are any outstanding questions that we didn't get to, please feel free to reach out to us. We can talk about it offline or put them in your comments, and we can have additional discussion on the UCAP topic in our next iteration of the proposal. But we did want to cover one additional topic that we have under the UCAP proposal today. We have a couple of slides on that. This is something that is new that we included in the 6th revised straw proposal. So we thought it was important for us to go over that today, give some time to go over the slides, and then take questions and comments on that before we get into the rest of the topics that we have on the agenda today. So that's what we'll do to continue the UCAP discussion. This last topic that we're going to cover is the minimum standards for QC counting proposal. This is something that the CAISO added to the UCAP proposal, and really our intent is to ensure QC counting is consistent among the different LRAs for the same resource ID. So what we're proposing is to ensure minimum standards for QC counting. And historically, the ISO has deferred to the local regulatory authorities to establish QC values for RA resources. If the local regulatory authorities set different QC values for the same resource ID, we've historically accepted the highest QC value submitted. And finally, if the local regulatory authority does not establish a qualifying capacity counting methodology, the CAISO has default QC criteria defined in our tariff. So if we can go to the next slide, please. The CAISO will continue to defer to LRAs to establish QC methodologies and will apply the default criteria when no QC method is adopted. But we've identified a need to ensure that the same resource ID is treated comparably among LRAs when establishing the QC. So just as an example, under today's rules, a solar resource that can sell RA to 2 different entities or under 2 different LRAs, where one entity sets the QC using ELCC and the other could use PMAX. The ISO would set the QC at Pmax under existing rules. So we think that under these existing rules, there's a need to ensure that the QC is somewhat comparable for the same resource ID under different LRAs. So what we're proposing is that we will not accept a QC value for a resource that is more than 10% greater than the lowest QC value adopted by another LRA for the same resource ID. And we're proposing to enforce this for all resources with the default QC criteria established in our tariff. So that's our proposal for minimum standards for QC counting. I'll go ahead and open it up to see if we have any questions or comments on the line.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad. Becky, will you let us know if anybody enters the queue?
Certainly. We do have a few questions on the line. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Oh, hi. This is Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. You guys hear me okay?
Hi, Susan. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Okay. I was just curious, has this been, is this a frequent problem or a serious problem for the ISO? Are there a lot of situations where this happens?
Susan, this is Carl. I wouldn't say it's a frequent problem or a large problem, but it is an issue for some resources and LRAs out there, and it is just a gap that creates some confusion in procurement that we were hoping to close, so that we have comparable measurements and assessments across LRAs and don't end up with discrepancies that may grow as we get different technologies on the system.
Okay, so but it turns out, for example, if you have co-located resource, or let me back that up a little bit. So if you have a generating facility that has, say, 3 or 4 resource IDs, and each resource ID only has one LR that has its own LRA, or they're not overlapping or sharing the same resource ID. The disparities between the QC numbers could still happen. You're not proposing that all the resource IDs have to comply with because they're all the same generating facility, right?
So no, this is going to be on a resource ID basis.
Okay.
And again, it's I think with the exception of probably demand response, I'm struggling to think of any resource that's not going to cross over multiple LRAs. I mean, any even solar or thermal out there, has opportunities with, CPUC as well as municipal jurisdictional entities. So,
right.
Again, the goal is just to kind of keep them comparable.
Okay, so if you have a solar project that has 4 phases and they're there are different LRAs for some of the phases, they can each keep their own counting methodology for their specific LRA, right? If they're all separate resource IDs.
I think the resource IDs, remember, the LRAs are the jurisdictional oversight to the load serving entities, not to the generation facility.
Right. No, I understand that. But let's say, okay, so there's a solar facility that has 2 different resources. Make a simple example: 2 different resource IDs, and it's just solar, okay? But there are 2 different resource IDs for 2 different parts of the project, and they have 2 different LRAs, and they have 2 different LRAs about different. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Can we stop right there? How does it have 2 different LRAs, Susan? It wouldn't. It has 2 different LRAs that can look at those resources and say, I value at X and I value at Y for resource A and B. But there's not an LRA for the resource.
No, I understand that. I'm talking about for the off-takers for those resource IDs. I do understand that we're talking about the off-takers and their regulators of the off-takers. So if there's 2 different phases of a solar project, 2 different resource IDs, and the local regulatory authority for each sellers for the 2 different phases are different entities, and they establish different counting rules. This proposal doesn't affect that.
It might, to the extent that the one LRA is saying, you know, you've got that solar resource and we're going to count it at Pmax, and the other one saying we're going to use ELCC, and the ELCC ends at 30 and the Pmax is 100, it would.
But they're two different resource IDs. They're not the same resource ID. This proposal looks to be for the same, if there's two different ones for the same resource ID.
Right. So
okay, but if these are two different resource IDs.
Yeah, but I want to be clear, Susan. If LRA, so LRA, let's use specific examples. We use Pasadena and the CPUC just for fun.
Okay, sure. Mm-hmm.
So we've got and a solar project that, you know, two phases, phase A and B. The PUC is going to look at both phases and say, we're going to give you a QC value.
No.
Oh, yes, they will. Yes.
No, well, no. The CP when you put in an NQC request for when one phase reaches COD, the NQC request goes in for the resource ID, and that's what you get back from the CPUC for, say, phase one.
No, you don't get you get a QC back from the CPUC. You do not get an NQC back from the PUC.
Okay, I'm sorry. Yes, you get a QC back from the CPUC. Okay, let's make it more specific. It's a 100 megawatt project, and 50 megawatts is for phase one has CPUC as the LRA, and 50 megawatts for phase two has Pasadena as the LRA. Phase one comes online. Yeah.
You can't talk about it in terms of the project coming on as under an LRA. It's coming on contracted to a PUC jurisdictional entity.
For part of it.
And the PUC has for part of it. But that doesn't mean the PUC doesn't also go out and look at phase two and say, okay, we've also got a value for phase two that we're looking at as well. The PUC is calculating QC values for all resources on the system, to my knowledge, with the exception of maybe some of the DR resources that are potentially unique to some of the municipalities. So we have crossover amongst LRAs about who's calculating different QCs. It's very rarely unique to a single LRA.
Well, QCs are based on resource IDs. That's how they're in the NQC list, or the NQCs are. So right. I guess my question is...
We can get multiple QCs for the same resource ID from different LRAs. And our tariff, as Lauren explained, we currently take the higher of those two values, or of the multiple values. And what we're saying is that we will no longer do that. We'll do it to a limit of 10% of what the other LRAs provide us QC values for.
Okay, so going with this is very confusing, because going with your example, if the CPC says, you know, the first 50 is worth 30, and the Pasadena says the first 30 is worth 20, or excuse me, the first 50 is worth 30, and the second 50 is worth 20. Okay, you will allow that second resource ID where Pasadena says it's only worth 20. You will give that today. You give that a resource or a QC value of 30 because the CPC has a higher one for the first resource ID. Is that what you guys do?
It would depend on what the PUC gave the second phase, right, Susan?
The PUC doesn't give the second phase a QC.
The PUC does give a second phase, Susan.
Okay, so in this circumstance, if the PUC says phase one is worth 30 and phase two is worth 30, and Pasadena says phase two is worth 20, you will still use 30 for phase two. That's what you do today.
We would allow up to 30 megawatts to be shown for RA from phase two, yes.
Even though the LRA that is regulating the off-taker for phase two says it's only worth 20.
That's right.
Okay, this could be a little bit better explained, because that does not seem, well, anyway, I'm going to leave it at that. That is a big surprise. Go ahead, sorry.
We agree with that, Susan, and that's part of what we're trying to fix, which is to say there are instances where you can end up with a large discrepancy between two LRAs. For example, if somebody's still using the exceedance methodology for a solar resource, to look at, the gross peak hours versus ELCC, you can end up with a large discrepancy. And so what we want to do is make sure that if they do differ, which we're not going to prohibit, we want to have them in a range where we can still look at them and say, yes, these resources, they have a slightly different methodology across LRAs, but we're still kind of capturing a comparable level of reliability, even if they differ by a little bit.
Okay, so today, in my example, let's say the first one was phase 1 was Pasadena, and they said it's for 20, and in phase 2, the CPUC says is that amount of capacity is worth 30. You would allow, even though Pasadena, that's regulating the off-takers, says that it's only worth 20, you'd allow it to count as 30.
No. So what's your time out? So there's a difference between what the final NQC list shows and then what that resource ultimately sells for and is shown to the ISO is RA. So now if Pasadena says, hey, you've bought the whole I bought the whole resource, it counts as 20, you can't sell anything else to anybody else. Pasadena,
no. We're still talking about two different phases to the two different, the off-takers that are regulated by two different LRAs. Okay, so I'm not saying Pasadena buys the whole thing. I'm just saying, let's say Pasadena is phase 1. Okay.
Susan, I think we're talking past each other a little bit. The phase 1 and phase 2 things is an irrelevant factor to the discussion, first off. So we don't need to think about different phases of this.
Well, different resource IDs, Okay.
I don't care. Let's just stick with a single resource ID. Because this happens today, it's the gap we're trying to fix, which is to say, I have resource ID A. Pasadena counts it as 30. QC counts it as 20. When we publish our final NQC list, it will say resource ID A, eligible NQC equals 30, and that's what is on the NQC list. Now, if a Pasadena, if Pasadena LFD is the entity that procures that resource in its entirety and shows it as RA, we won't see more than 20 of it, and that's cool. If a PUC jurisdictional entity is the one that procures that resource, we can see up to 30 under today's rules. And that's the rules as they exist today. I mean, that's not...
Right, but I guess I'm not understanding if you're doing this on a resource basis or resource basis like a whole generating facility or resource ID basis like different generating units.
Each resource ID will get its, can get its own QC.
Right.
So we'll apply that standard, 10%, no more than a 10% delta between submitted QC values from different LRAs on a resource ID basis.
Okay, so if a regenerating facility has two resource IDs, okay, and each resource ID has an off-taker that is regulated by a different LRA.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and those two LRAs for the two different resource IDs, one for each one, values it differently. Okay, today you take the highest of the two, even above what the LRA for specific resource ID will value it at?
We don't have a connection to an LRA for a resource ID, Susan.
Okay, I'm going to shut up. This is completely unclear to me, and perhaps I'm just completely missing something obvious, and I apologize if that's true. But
that's fine. I'm happy to talk more with you offline on this, Susan.
Okay, well, let me let others talk to see if there's a confusion among other people, and I'll apologize if I'm the only one. So let me get off now.
No worries, Susan. Thank you very much.
Okay. We'll proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Mary Lynch with Constellation. So Carl, is it correct that as an LSE, if we go out and procure for RA purposes from a resource where our LRA has approved a different NQC than you have, what happens in compliance? So we submit our compliance report to our LRA. We've complied with their counting rules, but is that going to fail in the supply plan submission by the resource owner who has an NQC that you've approved, and therefore that matching will fail, and then what happens?
So, Mary, I think what we're getting at here is that the NQC value that comes out of the ISO, because again, we only have a single NQC per resource, this will impact that number. So we at the end of the day put out an NQC value for all resources that we have QCs for, and that's where this will play in. So the number you have available to you to show to your LRA is pulled from that NQC list as well today.
So then just tell me where is it that someone can end up having one set of numbers that apply somewhere and a different set of numbers apply somewhere else? In other words, if an LRA, would it be possible for an LRA to be telling its jurisdictional entities that from our perspective, the NQC that can be shown from a particular resource is more than what the Cal ISO has put on their list? Or less, for that matter? If that can happen under what's proposed here, where you don't just accept the highest number, then if that can happen, then I'm just trying to understand what happens when we get into the compliance realm of showings.
Yeah. Yeah, again, our numbers that we produce is single NQC. To my knowledge, I don't know that, we've had problems with, because we've accepted the higher numbers today, we haven't any problems with conflicts on that from an LRA and compliance standpoint. But again, it's, compliance has historically been done, as I've understood it, to be done on an LRA basis from using the NQC list.
Okay, well, then I think that maybe partly to Susan's point, I think that there just needs to be more fleshing out of how this plays through the whole process of procuring and demonstrating compliance as between what gets submitted to the LRAs by their jurisdictional entities versus what gets submitted to you vis-a-vis supply plans that then, as I understand it, get matched up and there are consequences if they don't match. And if the answer is that can never happen, great. But it feels like it could happen, and the discussion of what that means for compliance has got to be further described, I think.
Okay. I think I appreciate where you're coming from here, Mary, and we'll see what we can please submit that in comments about your concerns on the compliance piece, and we'll try and clarify things out on the final proposal on this matter.
Okay. Thanks, Carl.
Okay, we'll proceed to the next question. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mike Whitney with NCPA. Just had a couple of questions, kind of focused on the hydro accounting rules and how different LRAs calculate them. In the middle of last year, the PUC adopted kind of like an optional accounting rule for hydro resources, where they're looking at the exceedance levels and the 50% and the 10% and putting the 80% and the 20% weights on them. And they indicated that it was more optional, so that they would calculate them, and then if the resource owner could prove that their actual NQC was higher, then they could apply for that, get it accepted. But however, if they accepted that default calculation, then they would be exempt from RAIM. So is that going to stay in place in the new paradigm? Is it still going to be optional? And if it's accepted, will they be exempt from UCAP or something?
This is Lauren. So I don't think we're proposing any changes to that. That could still be in place under this proposal. What we're talking about is more at the resource ID level, if there are multiple QC methodologies at the resource ID level for different LRAs.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Yeah, there was a lot of shock in the hydro community when those values were released, but it seemed like most of the entities were able to update those values, and then the PUC accepted them. So that shouldn't be an issue as long as that stays consistent. So thanks for clarifying that. And then as far as the 10%, I'm just kind of wondering, how that number was settled on.
Yeah, so we picked 10% because we did want to give still additional room for LRAs to somewhat adopt different QC values, but we wanted there to be some consistency. So we chose 10% as what seems like a reasonable starting point to allow LRAs to have somewhat different counting methodologies, but still provide that consistency between LRAs.
Okay, yeah, it just seems, a little arbitrary. So, when you guys throw out those numbers, just if you could include some kind of empirical support or just a little discussion of how they were derived going forward, we'd appreciate that. So that's all I have. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay, great. Thank you. So at this time, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Carl to discuss the planned outage process enhancements.
Okay, I can operate a mute button today. All right, thank you very much, everybody. Good morning. Happy Wednesday. So we're going to go through some revisions that we've made to the planned outage process proposals. We've basically taken a step back at some level and tried to take a two-phased approach on this to revisit some of the proposals that we had put out earlier, but again, wanted to have a very focused first step in this process to address concerns identified in the root cause analysis for the August events. And so we're going to look at both a phase one and a phase two approach. Phase one will be an interim approach while we work through the details of what we're looking at as a longer-term approach. So phase one goes with the proposal that we put forward in our last working group, which is to say that all planned outages would have to bring full substitute capacity for approval. We'll get into the details of how that would happen as we go through this. And again, this would be a very focused, very, what we're aiming for is very simplistic implementation, something that we can have up and running for our summer 2021 for planned outages. Then phase two would look at going back to, because again, we did see, again, pushback for our dismissal of what we then called the planned outage reserve margin. We're kind of changing our notations of it and maybe thinking about it a little bit differently, but going through and developing a longer-term proposal to establish a planned outage pool for resources. This was requested by some of the generating community as well as some of the load-serving entities. So again, it was an issue that we did want to revisit. But it's not something we felt like we could get in place in a timely manner, which take a fair amount of time to develop. And so we are going to make that a phase two, something that will roll through past this draft final proposal stage. Can we go to the next slide? All right. Okay, so I've been having connectivity problems. It's my turn today. Bridget? So again, the overarching objectives and principles for planned outage process, we want to encourage resources to get in early to let us know what they're planning so that we have as long a lead time as we can get to make sure that planned outages are readily facilitated and allowed to occur such that we have, again, reliable resources. That's been one of our core objectives through the entirety of all of this proposal is to encourage and incentivize low forced outage rates, and that means to kind of the flip side of that is to encourage timely and effective maintenance. So we want to get those in early. We want to avoid denying any outages that have already been approved. This is when a resource comes in 60 days ahead of time and says, hey, I need to take a planned outage. We look at things, everything looks okay. We approve the planned outage only to subsequently come back and say, well, we've now identified that A, you're an RA resource, and B, we're going to need you to be available, so we're going to have to deny that, and doing so at a fairly late stage in the process. We really want to try and avoid that. We want to identify the specific replacement requirements for resources that do require replacement. So what we've done here, or what we're going to do in the long term, is try and do that replacement up front by creating a pool of resources that can be pulled from and allow other resources to take outages. We're not going to really get too deep into the longer-term proposal today, simply because our focal point is going to be on the short term, and the development of that longer-term process will occur in subsequent iterations of this initiative. We do want to include the development of an ISO system for procuring the replacement capacity, and what I mean by that is having that pool in place and facilitating transparency and information so that resources know when would be good times to take those outages and when resources are available to facilitate that. And then, again, long term, we'd like to minimize and or eliminate the need for substitute capacity. This is something that, again, as we've looked at some of the challenges that come along with the RA market as it works today, having that requirement does create an incentive to withhold a little bit of capacity to either ensure you have that substitution available to take a planned outage, alternatively to make sure that if you have a forced outage, you have the ability to put in substitution to avoid rain. So to the extent that we can eliminate any incentives that might currently exist to withhold capacity, such as having these replacement obligations, we are looking to do so. Let's go to the next slide. So some of the challenges we have right now with planned outages is we do see a lot of the planned outages coming in with ample time and notification in either the long or mid-range planned outage windows. Those happen up to 45 days prior to the month. And so we do see a lot of outages come in, and the challenge we face today is that with our current planned outage substitution obligation processes, we don't do the assessment as to whether or not a resource needs to submit planned outages until 20 days prior. So a resource comes in 60 days prior, they're not RA until 45 days prior, but they still don't know if they need to provide substitution until 20 days prior. So there's this gap where the resource is kind of hanging out and waiting to find out, do I need to buy replacement capacity or not? So it's kind of a hedge of, what the expected outcome of that is going to be. If you expect that you'll need replacement capacity, you may go out and get it, but if you don't, because the ISO has not always required that in the past, you may find it to be a least cost solution to just kind of wait and maybe you get out of it from a, if it's 70% chance of not needing replacement capacity, that may be worth the risk of not procuring additional capacity for the potential cancellation of the outage. So in this circumstance, what we've seen is, and again, this is happening, I think, somewhere around 2% of the requested outages this happens, which is the resource ultimately does receive a request for planned outage replacement and is unable to provide that capacity, and then the ISO subsequently denies that outage. So again, it's not a frequent occurrence, but it does happen. And again, all of the planned outages that we have approved and then subsequently denied occurred for failure to provide substitute capacity. It's not like they were canceled for some other nefarious reason. It's just simply not getting that capacity. So let's move to the next slide. So the long and short of what we're proposing in the immediate term is to eliminate this uncertainty by simply requiring all RA resources that request planned outages to submit substitute capacity. The specific timing of these depends on when the outage request comes in, because again, if you're providing the outage request in the long or mid-range windows, we don't know if you're RA or not. And so what we're looking at is the resources would then have to submit the substitute capacity at the time of the RA showings. The specific timing we're looking to see if there's like a day or two difference between, when the showing is made and the substitution has to come in. But ostensibly, we're proposing that substitute capacity has to be made at the time that we're looking to validate the RA showings for adequacy for the month. If the outages are happening in the short range window, then the substitute capacity would have to come in at the same time that the outage request comes in, so that, again, it's a simultaneous, here's my outage request, and it should be okay that I take this outage because here's the capacity that's going to fill in the gap for me. So that's the basic gist of what we're proposing for planned outage substitution. So why don't I pause here to see if there are any questions on this front. Again, this is a short-term solution that will be in place for summer 2021 through the implementation of a longer-term solution, which we hope, again, would be in place for RA year 2023 with many of the other provisions that we're building here in the RA enhancements.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing pound 2.
Okay. We do have several questions in the queue. Caller, your line is muted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Phoenix Consulting. Just a clarifying question. I apologize if this is really stupid, but we've got phase 1 in summer 2021. So when you say summer, are you talking about starting in May, or when do you have thinking this would actually start?
June 1, I think, is our goal.
June 1, okay. All right, and is there any way, if someone is looking for substitute capacity, has the ISO considered some kind of bulletin board or some way, since there's no bilateral capacity, or there's no organized capacity market other than bilateral here, some way to help people find that kind of capacity?
I mean, we've had a bulletin board available. Nobody's ever used it, so okay. I actually don't know what the status of that is anymore. I mean, it's been there. I think people just pick up the phone and make calls at this point.
Okay. All right. Those are all the questions I had. Thanks.
All right. Thanks.
Oh, sorry, one more question. Sorry. So it starts in 2021, but until 2023, this obligation isn't just for summer 2021 or just for the summer. This would start in June 1st and go until the substitute, the phase 2 is implemented?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Thanks very much for the clarification.
Yep. No worries.
Okay. We'll proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, it's Mary Lynch again with Constellation. Carl, it's two questions. One is, if this full replacement is implemented, does that carry with it the ability to reduce the PRM?
No, planned outages are not included in the PRM.
So there's no component of the planning reserve margin that's there to, make sure the system is safe for planned outages?
Not for planned outages. Yeah,
okay.
Planned outages. Forced reserves and forecast error, but not planned outages.
Okay. And then my second concern that I'll be discussing with my team is that if you're planning to implement this new full substitution required for summer of 2021, my supposition is that there are already contracts executed for summer of 2021 that didn't contemplate this, and I don't know what this kind of change in the rules means for those contracts, and whether we'll want to ask to consider some kind of grandfathering or something, but just wanted to raise it as a potential concern.
understand that concern, Mary, and the data we've shown or that we've looked at shows planned outage rates in the summer typically pretty small to begin with. Is that's just typically the time when generators want to be available and online. Sorry.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So we typically see lowest planned outage rates during that interval. So hopefully it's not a big deal. Okay, operator, any more questions on this?
Yes, there are more questions of the queue.
4, okay, we're popular this morning.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Carl. Jason Cox from ADF.
Hey, Jason.
CAISO is the only market in the U.S. or North America, for that matter, that requires, substitution for planned outages. Other markets actually go about this differently by simply prohibiting summer maintenance. That doesn't, it's not planned maintenance, but if there's a window of cool weather or something where it's not necessarily, so hot that they need everything, they do allow, say, maintenance that they can call back within 72 hours. So there's other things. I mean, what I would say is you're simply going to be denying a lot of outages because people, with the dearth of replacement out there right now, you're just going to have generators run until they have to take a forced outage. So I don't know, this is one of the worst elements of the CAISO's proposal so far, and I really would like you guys to rethink it.
So Jason, one thing I did want to clarify is we are not foreclosing opportunities for the short-term opportunity and off-peak outages that currently exist now. So those are kind of like those kind of more last-minute type outage requests where it's like, hey, we've hit a cool spell. It's Friday night. Can I, take an outage, get some repairs done over the weekend? We still have and will still grant. We still have the discretion to grant those outage requests. We're not proposing to eliminate those.
No, and I'm not saying you are. I understand those exist. What I'm saying is, for a planned outage, that they have to show up with replacement or substitution, good luck.
For those outages that I talked about. Okay, so those off-peak and opportunity outages, those would not require replacement capacity.
I'm not saying those, but your typical planned outages don't happen off-peak and on the weekend, right?
Yeah.
You hear where I'm coming from? And they're typically planned out sometimes years in advance, depending on the company and the facilities in question, right? So, other markets do this by lumping all of their loss of load expectation into their peak period, be it summer or winter, and allow people to take planned outages, and now they ration that sometimes on even a weekly basis based on what's available and what the expected loads are. But there are ways around, having to have people bring substitution. I mean, it's just ridiculous. And there are better ways to do it. Just because you guys have done it that way in the past does not mean that's the best way to do it going forward, even on a short-term basis.
Yeah, no, I mean, in previous iterations, Jason, we actually proposed that we would, because we looked at PJM, I think did it this way where they don't actually allow any summer outages. And again, the benefit of the annual RA program is, like you said, they focus all their loss of load expectation in those summer months. And so they've only got those high RA requirements in those intervals. And so it gives them a lot of latitude for RA resources in off-peak months to take a planned outage. And so we proposed that. It was not very well liked. And so, again, for this purposes, what we're looking to do is remove the uncertainty that we've got right now, which is to say, will we subsequently deny that planned outage because we couldn't find that replacement capacity? We're giving the generators the opportunity now to try and find that ahead of time so that, they're not coming in waiting and hoping that they don't need that replacement capacity 20 days prior to the month.
No, understood. But what I'm telling you is a lot of people don't like things because they don't know about them, right, and how they actually work. This has worked really well in PJM and other markets, right? And yes, they like to know it as early as you want to do a planned outage, but they allow it even in peak winter season. So I mean, you don't have to come up with replacement, which is I don't know, it just seems illogical to me. So, and to the extent you start denying planned outages, you're going to have more forced outages because people will simply run it till it breaks, or they'll take a forced outage to do what they need to do. A lot of these things, their maintenance crews set up months ahead that they get to pay for whether or not they have the outage window, approved.
Okay. I appreciate that concern, Jason. We're looking for something. Again, we don't want this to be the long-term solution because I think those concerns are there is a basis for them. I won't deny that. But at the same time, what we're looking to do is fill a short-term need to make sure that we've got adequate capacity through those, particularly the summer months, but having a rule that's applicable for all months. So the sooner we can get this, the longer-term vision implemented, where you have that greater latitude, the better. But again, for very short and focused efforts for this summer and next, this is really the only option we had to get something implemented to maintain reliability through the summer months.
Carl, I will agree with you for the peak period, but for the on-peak period, you do not need all the RA that has been procured, right? You simply
when
don't.
You say non-peak, Jason, are you talking months or are you talking hours?
I'm talking months. Say outside of your summer period, which is likely to be wider if you have October, I'm fine with that. Once you're outside of that period, you do not need every single megawatt that's been required per RA during the peak period. You don't. It's just not true.
I'm not, Jason. What I recognize and the dilemma that we deal with in California is the monthly construct, which is to say, and we've heard this in many of the other areas of our proposal, which is to say, well, February you've got a lot of extra capacity out there bidding in and playing in the market, so how RA performs at any given point in time is irrelevant. Well, there may be a basis for that in kind of the market theory, but the construct and the planning tool we have is a monthly one. And so, if we want to move away from that, you're not going to get a lot of argument from me, quite frankly. But this is what we're dealing with. And so in those off-peak months where there should not be a dearth of options for substitution, we still have a requirement to maintain that the planning tool is there for a reason. Otherwise, like I said, moving to an annual construct, you won't get pushback from me. But this is the paradigm in which we exist here in California. So I do respect the benefits that come from an annual program, but that's not what we have.
Carl, it's still doable even on a monthly basis. I mean, you have an expected peak load for that month, right? You can allocate out planned outages that don't require substitution on a weekly basis. It's absolutely doable, and it's a lot more practical than just saying bring your substitution. That may or may not be available. And anecdotally, we're telling you when we're trying to go out and find substitution, it's not always available.
Yeah. Okay. I appreciate your perspective, Jason, and again, the diversity of views that you bring from the other ISOs as well, and comments you made over the last day as well as this. So I don't want to downplay that. I think that we are looking at this a little bit differently, though, which is to say, ARIA is the tool that we rely on for adequacy purposes, peak, off-peak, whatever. So from that planning standpoint, we want to maintain sufficient capacity in that pool of resources to meet forecasted peak. I appreciate that, please provide this in comments that, the off-peak months that you don't see the need to put that substitution into RA. I think we do differ on perspectives on that, though. But thank you very much.
next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Carl, it's Eric Little from Edison. Just a quick question kind of along these same lines. There was a BPM change just recently that for a solar resource that was taking an outage after sunset, that the substitution requirement was relieved. Is that going to stay in place, or does that get changed based upon this proposal?
Was that request as an off-peak opportunity outage request, Eric? Do you know?
I don't. It's a planned outage, but I suppose, does it matter? If the planned outage is being taken, whether it's a short-term opportunity or not, and it's a solar resource, and the outage starts after sunset and ends before sunrise, you weren't going to expect to get energy out of that resource during that period of time anyhow.
Yeah, that scenario, Eric, I think qualifies as an off-peak opportunity outage for which we would not require substitute capacity.
Okay. Thanks, Carl.
Yep. Okay. Let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Carl. Brian Baker with Middle River Power. Understanding that there are some situations in which a resource is uniquely needed and the ISO can't permit that outage, whether or not the substitution is provided, acknowledging that in a situation where a resource is not uniquely required, but it brings substitution at the time of the planned outage request, which may be well in advance of the T-minus 45 RA showing. Is there any reason why the ISO wouldn't approve the outage at that point, but would still wait until the RA showing?
I'm going to defer to, I think we've got Didi Sabakti and Abdul Muhammad Ali on the phone. I'll defer to our OES folks to verify. I don't think so, but this is their study process, and I want to let them confirm that.
Yeah, I think you're right. Under normal circumstances, if it is not needed for a local transmission constraint and they already bring a substitution, or if they're not shown even, yeah, no, you're right.
Okay, thank you, Didi. Thank you, Carl.
Okay, we will proceed to our next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. Can you hear me?
Gotcha, Kathleen.
Great. Thanks, Carl, and thanks for this is a really helpful discussion. I want to, I guess, I'll make a brief comment kind of on the merits of what you have brought forward. And then I also my main comment that I wanted to bring forward was more process related. Because I don't want to belabor what Jason discussed. I largely agree with. I have to continue thinking about this new proposal. I definitely agree with the sentiment that in the off-peak months and the shoulder months, when there isn't a tightness in supply, the same as in the summer, that this kind of requirement is overly burdensome compared to what we have today. I also need to think through what benefit it provides relative to the status quo, because on first blush, at least from a market participant's perspective, I understand that there is uncertainty. We submit a planned outage, and like Jason said, it could be years, like 1 to 2 years prior to our planned outage. Obviously, it is planned under best practice to be in months that don't have a tight supply need in the off-peak months. But the T-minus 22 assessment on what proposed that begins, yes, there is uncertainty, but that's uncertainty that we are familiar with today, and we already have assessments and approaches to mitigate that uncertainty. This proposal appears to add a larger risk that I am not certain the level of substitution capacity that would be needed for all the planned outages, regardless of time, really would be available in the current market environment. And I think that's very important to think about. If that substitution is literally not available, what happens, right? So I think we need to be sensitive to the fact that that there is a supply shortage in our current market construct. There are other efforts being explored to increase the amount of supply in the fleet on a more like midterm to long-term basis. I just want us to be sensitive of all these moving pieces, right? So if it may not be prudent to require substitution for all planned outages. I actually think that's one of the things that, at least while there may be challenges with the current process, it's something that we have some certainty that when we receive a POSO that it is needed for reliability. And I think that helps at least me understand why there is a need to go out and try and find that substitution capacity. With a less amount of substitution needed, given just the tightness in the supply right now, it's more likely that there would be able to find that substitution. Is it guaranteed? No. And so the challenges that you hear suppliers talk about is that it's so tight that the ability to get substitution can be challenging. I'm not sure I think that challenge is mitigated by this proposal. I can see the concept of, oh, hey, let's tell them that they have to do it sooner than T-minus 22, and then that hopefully there will be more supply. But a lot of that supply is locked up going into the year. And I just wanted to raise that, give that to the CAISO for you to think about. And again, just to urge you that
Kathleen,
this may not be beneficial.
I want to capture a couple.
Yeah, please.
Sorry, I want to capture a couple points in your initial thoughts there. First off, yeah, we recognize that in the summer months it's going to be hard, it's going to be tough. We also expect that there's going to be fewer requests for planned outages. And as you said, and this is part of what I think is a little bit confusing to me, which is to say, in those off-peak months, yes, there's a bunch of capacity out there. So that dearth of the capacity that exists in the summer doesn't exist in the non-summer months. So finding the substitution shouldn't be as challenging in March as it is in July, and we get that. But to simply say because there's stuff out there, we shouldn't require substitution to ensure that our planning standards are for RA are met is a little confusing to me. So again, we understand that it's going to create challenges in the summertime. But
one thing I want to point
in the non-summer.
I want to pull what you just said because I want to make sure that I'm not being misunderstood. I absolutely think that the current POSO is, and if I'm misunderstanding, please, but I've always understood it as doing that reliability assessment, given the needs on the system in a fresher time period with recent data relative to the RA fleet that's available. Is there a reliability need? So in no way am I suggesting that what I think I heard you say, which is that you shouldn't be setting up your rules in a way that you're ensuring reliability. I've understood the POSO to do that. All I'm saying is that I'm not sure I understand the marginal benefit of requiring 100% substitution without any kind of reliability assessment. And so I want to make sure that you were clear on that. That wasn't what I was implying. I'm merely implying that POSO has been in place and has been understood. It doesn't require 100%. It requires substitution when it's needed. And I think that's just I'm not seeing the benefit of this. And I would appreciate if the CAISO would think about really what is the marginal benefit. Now, I also want to caveat with, if this is intended truly to be an emergency response, a temporary emergency response for this summer, I think that is a different conversation. And that's one that I will spend more time thinking about. If on a temporary basis, in light of the emergency conditions just for the summer, so excluding off-peak months, is there more merit to this? And I will commit to taking that back and giving that some due deference. That's a commitment I think to the CAISO. My process question is that obviously we'll plan to attend the summer readiness meeting later today at 1 p.m. I believe that in that meeting you're going to explain how, even though that this is really trying to be one of the responses to being ready for the summer, it's going to remain in this process, but I'll make the same ask there that I make here. I think this seems like a response to that, and I would ask that we move the temporary short-term solution you're discussing to that process so we can evaluate the merits of it directly in response to our current needs.
Yeah, we're going to keep this here, Kathleen. I understand the ask. We're wrapping this up, and we want to be able to maintain the focus on the plethora of issues that team needs to focus on. We think this issue is by and large something that, you know, we've put it through a couple iterations, stakeholder comments, we've gotten the feedback, we understand the pros and cons of it from a stakeholder standpoint. So we're going to keep that issue here.
Just one follow-up is that one of the benefits, and I'm still going to make the ask, and I'll make them in my written comments. One of the benefits of doing that, if there is not consensus in the stakeholder community at this time, that it could be done on a temporary basis for the summer. We can get experience with it, comfort with it, and then the CAISO has a history of, in response to these types of emergency stakeholder processes. Lisa Canyon comes to mind, of sunsetting it and making pair changes permanent. There is a benefit to it. I strongly urge the CAISO to consider that. This is a big change, and having at least experience with it on a temporary basis, I think, would have a huge benefit. So thank you for your consideration.
Okay, thank you. So we are starting to run a little snug on time. I don't want to cut folks off on questions, but we do have one additional subject on this that I want to get to on proposed changes to how we deal with extending planned outages. Operator, how many callers do we have in the queue still?
We have 5 more questions in the queue.
Oh, yummy. Okay, so callers, what I think worked well yesterday, was I'm going to take 1 or 2 more questions. Hopefully they're shorter, the better, and then we can move on to the next piece. And those that I don't get to, please feel free to put those questions into the chat box. And once I complete this section, I'll do my best to go back and answer those for folks. So apologize, just trying to be respectful of the time and make sure we get the materials covered. So let's take 1 more question if it's quick, 2 if they're both quick.
Okay. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Carrie Bentley with the Western Power Trading Forum, and this is actually pretty quick. On the, I think it was Mary who asked about the bulletin board and whether that would be possible. You know, the original bulletin board was hosted by PJM and was really confusing. It wasn't functional. So and it was created at a time when there was a lot of excess capacity. So I was wondering if the CAISO would be willing in the comment template to ask stakeholders if it would be useful, if it's something that how often maybe they might use it, and what would be helpful to be included in a bulletin board. Because I personally think my job would be really helpful. So maybe you could take a new poll.
We had that in previous iterations, Carrie, and we just weren't feeling a lot of love for it. I don't have any real objection to asking about it, but there didn't seem to be a great interest in it in previous iterations. But, you know, if sentiments have changed given recent events, I'm open to reconsidering.
Yeah, and I don't remember an explicit, you know, especially with the comment templates, it's so important to have a specific topic on it. So if you could just make it a specific topic, I think that would be helpful. And then 2, I was wondering, this is probably a question for Dee Dee, and maybe this is what Brian was asking, but, you know, you're saying you have to have replacement. What if you end up in a situation where you need to take a planned outage for a week and that resource is absolutely needed as RA? Is the intention of the CAISO to say just don't put it on the RA plan and then you'll CPM it later if it's needed? What do you do in that very tight situation where there is no replacement capacity? They have to go on planned outage for a week, and there's no kind of other option, similar to what happened, for example, in August, right, where these planned outages were allowed. Just wondering if you fleshed that out.
Yeah, I think this is Didi. I think first, I'm actually not very familiar of planned outage that is being allowed in August. And this is actually one of the things that Carl is going to discuss about this extension of a planned outage, which is, I think, that's actually what happens in August is we have planned outage that was not planned in August but get extended to August, and that's a topic for the next discussion here. But you're right, Kier. I think the challenge that we have is just that. It's basically, you know that you have a planned outage at a certain month, and normally planned outage starts not on the beginning of the month, right? The planned outage normally starts on the beginning of the weekend, for example. And then the beginning of the weekend does not line up with the beginning of the month. So then what often happens in then all these resources are shown to be meeting our obligation, but then they're being taken out. So to me, I think we've always shared with people that if you already know that you're going to have a lot of outage, a big chunk of a month out, and you don't show it in the RA showing to begin with, that means that the validation whether or not we are meeting the RA obligation does not require that unit in there. So you are in the current world, you will never get a substitution because you never get substitution requirement because you're never really shown to begin with, in which case then it will most likely, or if not, it's actually secure all your outages to begin with. And then if we really need it, then yes, we will end up CPMing it, the outage, because it's not a shown RA. So that's how it's working right now.
Thanks, Didi, and I'll wait to hear the next topic. I appreciate that.
All right. I think I have to take advantage of the transition that Didi has given me. Operator, I apologize to the additional questions that are in queue. Like I said, if you can put those into the chat box, I'll answer all of those over the course of this meeting so that they're there not only for the question, or for the person making the question, but for all the stakeholders to see. So we are going to move on now to talking about how we handle planned outage extension requests. So let's go to the next slide. Okay. So again, as Didi mentioned, some of the outages we saw in August and some of the challenges we saw were not actually outages that the ISO approved in August, but outages that we approved in other months where maybe the opportunity looked like it was reasonable and something we could take advantage of. Those outages eventually got extended and extended and extended to the point where that same outage that we approved in June was still rolling through into mid-August. So looking at how we track and treat individual planned outage requests is something that we're also looking to and proposing changes to. So currently the resource, nope, not yet. Thank you. So currently resources on planned outages, if they request an extension because they're already on outage, we typically grant that extension simply because it's on outage. Our denying the request doesn't get them back online. They just are on outage still. The challenge, though, is that practice does not require substitution it does not require substitution, and it also does not provide adequate incentives to accelerate the completion of the maintenance. So we want to make sure that we get, well, at least one of those. So let's move to the next slide now. So in making these changes, we are looking to fill at least two objectives. The first is to classify planned and forced outages correctly, because, again, this classification does get posted publicly so that our stakeholders and market participants know what's happening in our markets. And, again, we also want to encourage SCs to replace the capacity when they take those planned outages, and even when they have those extensions, to make sure that that extended planned outage does not impair our ability to maintain reliable system operations. So let's go to the next slide. We contemplated in looking at the potential means to resolve this, we looked at two different scenarios. The first one is the outage starts, and on the beginning of the outage, the SC identifies that they won't be able to return to work in time, and so they request the extension at the very beginning of the planned outage early on in the process. And the second scenario is that they're going well, and then they hit a snag in the planned outage, and late in the process they identify that they're not going to be able to get back online in time and request the extension fairly late in the process. So we looked at these two scenarios and the options we contemplated, how they resolve each of those. So we looked at 3 different options. We'll go through each of those options now, and then we'll discuss what option we think, at least for the immediate term, offers us the greatest opportunity to address the planned outage extension request. So let's go to the next slide and talk about option 1. So under this scenario, or under this option, we do not allow the outage card extension. We instead require the SC to create a new outage card for the extension, so basically creating a new outage, planned outage request. In option 1, which is again where we have advanced notification, a long enough timeline to at least get into the short-term or short-range window, it would be classified as a planned outage. They'd have an obligation to provide substitute capacity under our new proposal. We would deny that outage, that extension request, if it's not provided, the substitution is not provided. We understand that there's no guarantee that they'll provide that substitution. If they don't, they would be submitting a forced outage card for that outage, and again, that would go towards UCAP provisions and potential rain penalties. But again, that extension is no longer the same outage. It's a completely new outage request. For the second scenario, when we're getting that request late in the process, at least some portion of that outage may still end up being classified as a forced outage. But anything, if it continues on beyond that, the possibility that the SC could submit 2 different outage cards, one for a forced outage for the, basically the time up until which they can get into the short-term window, and then this second outage would then potentially be reviewed as planned with replacement capacity and the like. So that's how we dealt with, or how we saw things being resolved under this option, where again we are now able to isolate the initial outage request from the extension request. Let's look at option number 2. So this is basically the status quo option, which is to say we allow the outage card to get extended as we do today. We continue to extend it as a planned outage. We look to implement the substitution obligation. This becomes more complicated because, again, the outage has already been approved, and trying to get that substitution becomes a little more challenging because we can't deny it, the outage now, because it is that same outage card. It's just an extension of the one outage. So it becomes much more complicated to deal with that outage as a single outage. This is one of the challenges we do have to deal with today. Let's look at option 3. So we allow the outage card extension. So basically we keep everything under a single option under this or single outage under this option. But the extension is only allowed if they provide substitute capacity. OMS will have to check if the units are shown as RA. And so we have actually a bit more of a complicated feedback into some of our systems, our outage systems, to make sure that the resources are RA, and then try and get the substitution connected to that. If they are shown as RA, we would only allow the outage if there's substitution. But the mechanics of this, we're not certain of how this would exactly work, because, again, how we have to connect all of the initial outage, the new substitution, and the like into that single outage. And then what we would do, or how we would terminate that outage if the substitution is not provided. So we have identified some complexities in implementation with option 3. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So if it wasn't obvious from how I presented this, our option that we're proposing is to go with option 1. We think that this is consistent with what we've proposed in the other elements of our changes to POSO rules, which is to say it does require the substitution for the extension. But because it creates a new outage, it actually creates a much easier administrative process for us to track through and separate the initial outage from the extension and the requirements that follow. So we actually think that this is a much clearer and cleaner way of handling outages and outage extensions, is to simply treat it as a new outage, and that way we can apply a clean set of rules to each time the extension comes in, as opposed to trying to create new tracking mechanisms to say when substitution was required, when it was provided, for how long it was provided. We can't, that tracking element, administrative element is horrifically burdensome, and so we think option one provides the cleanest solution. And then finally, it ensures the ISO has adequate capacity to maintain the reliability if the resource cannot return to service by having that outage, the replacement obligation, at least in this upfront period. When we move to our longer-term solution, some of these rules obviously will change because our goal is to move away from substitution obligations. But again, we're not degraded at all in terms of reliability for that planned outage extension, which, as DB noted a moment ago, was one of the challenges that we faced in our August, in the August heat waves. So let's pause there for questions. I think that the next piece of this is really just getting into our plan for the future, and I think we'll just fly through that and allow Milos to keep going into the imports because we still got a lot to cover.
Okay.
So, operator, any questions?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Susan Schneider, Senior Consultant. On slide 14, for your consequence for scenario 2 under your option 1, it seems, and maybe I apologize if I'm missing something, but if you have the outage extension, but they give you substitute capacity, they have not damaged system reliability. So why would that be classified? And I understand it's within the short range, after the end of the short range outage window, but why would that be classified as a forced outage if they're giving you substitute capacity?
Oh, it'd still be classified as forced. If they give a substitute capacity, that would exempt them from a rain charge.
Okay.
And in the future, it would well, let's just leave it at that because this is again.
Well, I guess that's okay. Yeah, I know it's short term. Okay, so you're not saying that. Yeah, so this is not a UCAP related thing because that would be after you'd be into phase 2 here by the time UCAP comes into play. Is that right?
That's the goal, yes.
Okay. Okay, I guess I'll stop there then. Thank you.
All right, thanks, Susan.
Okay, let's move on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, this is Kathleen again from Vistra. I have a clarifying question. I appreciate you going through the options, Carl. And yes, I think it was fairly clear from the way that you laid them out. So I'm going to bring my clarifying question in. I want to be clear, is your proposal option 1, scenario 1?
Well, both scenarios can occur. We don't get to pick the scenario, right, Kathleen? We have to deal with the timing as it comes to us.
So when you say last minute, are you meaning T-minus 7 days? Are you meaning T-minus 2? Is it the standard forced outage timeline? Is it a different one?
We'll be working under the existing rules for forced outages for this aspect of the proposal. So that would be
okay.
T-minus 8.
Okay. So just hypothetically speaking, planned outage is submitted for 2 weeks. And so in order to be considered under scenario 1, you'd have to submit a new outage card within the first week of that outage. We need to know that you had an issue with your outage in the first week. Otherwise, it would be under scenario 2. Okay.
That's right.
That clarification is very helpful. Thank you. On first blush, just food for thought, this sounds to me, and maybe it is a separate element, and it's up to you how you want to frame it. But what I'm hearing is really just one proposal that planned outages always submit substitution, 100% substitution requirement for all planned outages, even if extended. If extended, it will require a new outage card. And that to me kind of sounds like one proposal rather than two, but I just wanted to confirm that I'm connecting these correctly.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, two points of the same proposal, but yeah, that's fine.
Okay, no, that's fine. That is helpful. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you very much.
Okay, there are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Wonderful. Okay, so we're going to move on quickly then because, again, we don't really have the proposal developed at this point in time. It is part of our subsequent iterations. But, again, phase 2, we will continue to look improve transparency and ensuring a pool of resources available. So to the points that were raised earlier, instead of having individual resources try and go out and find substitute capacity, we are looking to create an additional pool of capacity that is readily available, not on a day-by-day basis, but as part of just a monthly term where resources are looking to take outages, they'll be available. This, we hope, will reduce incentives to this will hopefully reduce incentives to withhold capacity, again, to the extent that there are replacement obligations. We understand that some entities hold back a bit of capacity to make sure that they can do that. So we'll develop this pool to eliminate replacement obligations. Hopefully this will help also facilitate outage coordination, so trying to provide some of the transparency. You know, we talked a little bit about a bulletin board earlier. I think we continued to talk about the prospect of creating a calendar where we could show what kind of availability we have remaining in the pool or the expected pool so that resources could try and take some of those planned outages when there's adequate capacity known to be available to them. In response to stakeholder comments, one of the pushbacks we got was the reluctance to allow for or to create a pool for summer months. So to be clear, we'll explore it. We remain concerned that the challenges of achieving this objective are going to be limited just simply due to insufficient capacity to fill the pool, basically. But it's something we'll explore. If we can make it work, we'll frankly make it work. So again, we came back on this simply because initially we had foreclosed this, but we got some pretty significant pushback on this from stakeholders. I think on our initial review, frankly, we saw the opposition and didn't really fully contemplate some of the nuance to the opposition, which was, well, we think we could get behind this if, you know, you deal with how we treat some of the hydro outages or how we treat summer planned outages. So let's not give up on this so quickly. So we do appreciate stakeholders coming back and saying and reiterating some of their more nuanced objectives. It has changed our course on how we think about this. So I do appreciate folks not giving up on this option and helping us clarify that. Okay. I think I'm going to defer on the next two slides. I don't think they add a whole lot since we are still developing this and we'll have ample opportunity to discuss this further. I think the time is better spent transitioning over to Milos to talk about the imports component of this. I will allow for one final opportunity for questions, but I think people really probably raring to go and find out what the ISO has to say on the imports piece.
Okay, we do have a question in the queue at this time. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Carl. This is Kathleen again from Vistra. Just one quick question. I know you wanted to move on, but I am a little confused about what you just mentioned. So are you proposing for the planning reserve margin, the planned outage reserve margin in this final, in your proposal or not?
No. this will be developed further in subsequent iterations within the stakeholder process as part of what I think we're calling phase 2 as part of the longer-term objective to be met for starting RE year 2023.
Do you recall if that's 2A or 2B?
To be or not to be? No, I don't recall how we broke that one off.
Okay, no worries. I will look back. Thank you.
Kathleen, this is Lauren. It's in 2B.
Thank you, Lauren.
Let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Mohan Nirola with CDWR. Hi, Carl. I have a question on slide 10. Earlier, I wanted to ask a question, but I'm just taking this opportunity. A quick question.
All right.
At the time of submission at, let's say, at T-45, if a resource in the plan has planned outage requested but not approved, and at T-5 the resource is submitted in the plan, will that resource be validated?
I'd have to think about that specific level of the process, Mohan. Put it in your comments, and we'll make sure we get it addressed.
Okay, I'll do that. And the second question is, in all of these cases, if ISO disapproves the planned outages at different time frames, the impact, if the resource owner cannot find a substitute, then the ultimate impact will be UCAP, right?
Because they at the end of the day, yes. Like when we move forward, yes.
Okay, that's me. Okay. And I think I have a question on the 100% requirement. So if there is only one day, outage, planned outage that the resource owner cannot find a substitute, will that be a significant concern for CAISO? Maybe we can think about let's say 5% of capacity or 5% of the day for the month can be exempt from requirement, but 95% maybe, worth considering requiring substitution. Otherwise, those one day or, a little bit of capacity may not be available, but still can work for RA. So I'm just thinking about that.
Yeah. Submit it in your comments, Mohan. My initial response is I think creating kind of special circumstances like that runs risk of complicating and saying, 5% is okay, why not 6, why not 10, why not 15? And we try not to go down those slippery slopes, but we'll think about it.
Okay. Thank you very much.
All right. So with that, like I said, if there are additional questions, feel free to put those in the chat box. I'll do my best to answer all of those. And without further ado, Milos, take it away.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. So we're going to be talking about the RA imports proposal. This element is in the draft final proposal stage. And since we're running a little bit snug on time, I'm going to kind of go quickly through some of the background slides so that we can dedicate most of our time to the substantive sections of the proposal. But by all means, I'll stop. There's natural breaks in the presentation. I'll stop for questions, and feel free to ask any questions or clarifications. So starting on slide 24, I think you've heard this throughout yesterday and today, and some of you stakeholders have mentioned this, but obviously supply conditions across the West are fairly tight and tightening in the coming years. You may recall that last year the ISO highlighted the capacity shortfall across the state and emphasized the value of imports in helping manage grid conditions, especially during the net load peak hours as solar generation is ramping down. At the same time, across the Western interconnection, as states are moving towards cleaner energy policy goals, we're also continuing to see older base load resources starting to retire, further tightening supply across the West and potentially impacting imports to California. And as a final point, I'll note that something that we've seen over the last couple of years, especially with some of these severe weather events that have impacted us. Those severe weather events have become more common and have impacted not only the CAISO, but really have been impacting several BAs at the same time. So further tightening those impacting system conditions, impacting the need for supply, and impacting the ability potentially to get imports in the future. So with that background in mind, let's go to the next slide. And briefly here, some of the current policy framework for RA imports, has a lot of areas that are not addressed that add reliability risk for the CAISO. One of the elements is that non-resource specific RA imports can support, non-resource specific resources can support RA imports, which means that the physical source is not known. There's not a dedicated physical source for supporting these imports. And it poses a risk, again, to supply not being committed to the CAISO when it matters most, when conditions are tight. And additionally, there's a lack of a transmission delivery requirement in place today, which means that RA imports could be delivered on the lowest priority transmission service, which is subject to, high risk of curtailment to the extent there's a curtailment on any of the adjoining transmission systems across which the capacity is being delivered on. And so that transmission delivery risk, again, poses an impact to our reliance on and dependability on RA imports. Let's go to the next slide quickly. So just briefly, I'll go over some of the objectives that have been common throughout the different iterations of the initiatives related to RA import rules. But one of the key objectives is ensuring that RA imports are backed by physical supply and are committed to the CAISO, meaning that they're dependable then and reliable. Another objective is to ensure that RA imports are delivered on high priority transmission service that, again, ensures that during tight conditions, during system events, these are not the first ones to be curtailed and are deliverable to the CAISO. Another objective is to treat RA imports more comparably to the treatment of RA import resources located inside of the ISO Balancing Authority area. And finally, in developing these rules, our objective was to reasonably assimilate the policy proposal to the practices of other ISOs and RTOs in this space. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, so the RA import elements of the proposal that we're going to go over today, these are what we deem or what we see as minimum requirements that must be met by all RA imports. And these are the requirements that relate to source specifications, the transmission arrangements that support RA imports that we'll cover later, as well as the attestation requirements that must be met for RA imports. We think that the setting of these minimum requirements will help ensure that all LSCs are procuring imports to support RA needs of the same quality and attributes that provide us with the dependability that we need from these resources. We envision that local regulatory authorities will continue to have the ability to set incremental additional requirements or restrictions for their jurisdictional LSCs regarding RA imports, but we believe that these should be the minimum requirements that must be met by all RA imports that are shown on supply plans. And we're going to go over those here in the next few slides. Let's go to the next slide. So before we jump into each of the discrete elements of the proposal, just wanted to provide an overview so that as we go through each one of them, you can at least keep the other ones in mind and see how it all fits together. But RA imports have to be resource or balancing authority area specific, and we'll talk about what that means. RA imports also have to be delivered on high priority transmission service, firm transmission on the last leg, transmission leg to the ISO, and then on all the other intervening transmission legs, we provide a little bit more flexibility by allowing deliveries to be made on monthly non-firm transmission service or higher. And then RA imports also have to meet attestation requirements that are really intended to ensure that this capacity is committed to the CAISO. And then finally, we are introducing a interim real-time must-offer obligation for RA imports that we'll talk a little bit more. So RA imports would have a day ahead plus a real-time must-offer obligation, at least on an interim basis, until the day-ahead market enhancements initiative further fleshes out real-time must-offer obligations under that initiative. Let's go to the next slide. We'll start with the dedicated source proposal element. It only has 2 slides, and then I'll pause for questions after that. So there are going to be 3 types of resources that are going to be qualifying for that can provide RA imports. The first 2 I think you're familiar with. These are available today, are able to provide RA imports today, pseudo-tied resources and dynamically scheduled resources. And then the third element is the new element, and we're creating a new term that's called non-dynamic resource-specific resource adequacy imports to distinguish. The non-dynamic is to distinguish it from pseudo-tied and dynamically scheduled resources. But this could be a single resource from a BA. It could be a specified portfolio or aggregation of resources within a single balancing authority area, or it could be a balancing authority area's pool or system of resources. That means that we would no longer permit non-resource specific imports to be eligible to provide RA import capacity. They could still bid into the market, provide energy, but they would not count towards providing resource adequacy. Let's go to the next slide. So in the context of those 3 types of RA imports, then there are source specification requirements associated with each one of them. And the intent here is to ensure, again, that these resources that are shown as RA imports are backed by physical supply. And so we're going to request some information to be provided that demonstrates that. So for each one of the RA imports, we're going to be requiring that the name of the resource or resource set supporting that RA import be identified along with the source balancing authority area ETAG identifier. So to the extent that balancing authority area has a specific acronym or identifier that's used on ETAGs, we would request that be identified as well. So name plus that identifier, because that's ultimately going to allow us to, when we're looking at tags, be able to match up the resource to the tag. And then we're also going to be requesting that the name of the single source balancing authority area be identified where that resource or resources are located. The one nuance here is that if the RA import is a non-dynamic resource-specific RA import that is consists of a balancing authority area's pool or system of resources, we would only require the source balancing authority area to be identified. And this is because some of these balancing authority areas, to the extent it's a system of resources, there could be a really high number of resources supporting that. So we would just, rather than asking the identification of each resource by name, we would request that the source balancing authority area only be identified. This information, the source-specific information, will be required to be provided at the time of the submission of the supply plans, both in the monthly and the annual timeframes. So the information then would be provided by the scheduling coordinator who is submitting that RA supply plan and who ultimately will be scheduling these resources in the ISO market. And the RA supply plan template will have discrete fields for the provision of this information. There will be a field for the identification of the name of the resource and the ETAG identifier, as well as a field for the identification of the source balancing authority area. I think that element will be a drop-down box where you will be able to pick the source balancing authority area. And we will have validations in place that in CIRA that would not allow the acceptance of that plan to the extent that these fields are not provided and there's an RA import identified on the plan. So I'll pause here for questions since I think the next slides get into the attestation element, but I'll pause here for questions on the source specification requirement as well as anything in the background.
As a reminder, you can enter the question queue by pressing #2 on your telephone keypad.
Okay, we do have a couple of questions in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Minna. So this is Wei Zhou from SCE. How are you doing?
Hi, Wei. Good. How are you?
Hi. Thank you. So I think I have a question about, actually I have two questions. One is, I think, on the substantive, I think you're proposing something that's quite different than the current rules being adopted by the PUC. The PUC already have very stringent bidding rules. I think that will take care of, the discussion about the speculative supply and, the double counting or perceived double counting concerns. The rules also say you should not or you are not allowed to source from within the CAISO. I think those rules kind of already address the concerns around the speculative supply and, perceived double counting. I think it's gone through maybe a year or 2 years, just several discussions, and finally, establishes the rules. And also, this summer, all the CAISO reports about the market performance during the summer month this year, 2020, and heatwave events in the last summer, kind of confirmed, the imports are delivering, the energy as expected. No, I think the issues are more on exports. So I'm just wondering, has the CAISO done any analysis to show that, the either CPUC rules we have today are not effective? I think I kind of understand the desire to have the source specification, but I don't quite understand what are the real, problems the CAISO trying to address by proposing the source specification, attestation, and also the firm transmission. So can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Sure, and I think we'll get to some of those other elements, the transmission requirement and the attestation here a bit later. But in covering the source specification requirement, again, in looking at all of these rules, we're really trying to future-proof the RA program, and especially related to RA imports. Today you could have a non-resource specific RA import, but really not be backed by physical supply. And so once you get into a real event where you need those resources to be available, that capacity or that energy may be sold elsewhere and not available for the RA import. And so what we're trying to do here is ensure that all the RA imports that are shown in supply plans are backed by physical supply, by specifically identified resources, to ensure that that same capacity is also available, but it's not double sold to other parties. By specifying that capacity and then, combined with some of the other elements that we're going to go through, the attestation requirement, particularly if you identify the resource and you attest that that capacity hasn't been sold elsewhere, that ensures that that capacity then is committed to the CAISO. And when we get into tough situation and tough system conditions where that capacity is needed, we expect it to be there and delivered to the CAISO if awarded. So really, I think all of these three elements that we're going to go over, the transmission requirement, the source specification, and the attestation, is altogether really intended to ensure that the resources that are shown are committed to the CAISO, are real resources, and are also deliverable, so that if we are in tough system conditions, we can depend on those and ensure that and be confident that they're going to be delivered and are real resources that we can depend upon.
Yeah, I think as I mentioned, I do understand the desire and why you are proposing those, but I don't understand, what are the real problems you're trying to address that haven't been dealt with and the kind of rules, and what is the benefit and the cost and the CAISO proposal for import RA. So I think that's a concern. I do have another question about you present this as a minimum requirement. I think yesterday there was discussion. I think Carl did a good job explaining the notion that the CAISO wants to fully coordinate with local regulatory agencies and has a goal to kind of achieve full alignment between the agencies or institutions. So I think when you present this as minimum requirements, it just I'm very confused. But when you say it's presenting those as a minimum requirements, if there's no alignment between what the rules we have today that's adopted by CPUC and what potential new rules going to be enforced by the CAISO. So, I think the consistency is very important. So I would be curious to know what CAISO plan on this in light of the, a coordination and alignment with CPUC on this one.
Sure. Thanks, Wei. So, we have also proposed or submitted this proposal in the CPUC proceeding, and we're looking forward to working closely, in moving this proposal through that process. But we do think that these are, again, prudent enhancements to the RA import rules that, again, are going to future-proof it to ensure that the RA imports that we get are reliable and dependable. Now, I think we have 26 different LRAs, or local regulatory authorities, in the CAISO, and to us, it's important that the rules that we set here, these minimum requirements, from all those 26 LSDs that are responsive to those 26 LRAs, that they meet the same standards of quality for RA imports that are submitted to us. If we have each LRA developing their own rules or deeming certain types of RA imports as being sufficient for their needs compared to others, I think we run the risk again of potential impacts to reliability if some of these RA imports do not meet these minimum requirements on, are not delivered on the type of transmission that we're looking for it to be delivered, are not, the LSC does not know the source of the physical capacity, or they cannot meet the attestation requirement that that capacity hasn't been sold elsewhere, and that is shown in the supply plan. I think at that point, we don't have the confidence that the RA imports, when shown in those supply plans, would be sufficient to meet the system needs. So that's why we're moving towards these minimum requirements to ensure that all LSCs that are showing RA imports and supply plans meet these same set of minimum standards that provide that dependability to RA imports. Because as we noted, system conditions across the West are tightening. We know that we're competing for import capacity with other areas, and we want to make sure that whatever is shown on the supply plans for the CAISO is something that we can rely upon when shown a month in advance. That's the key, really. I think when you're showing things on the annual and the monthly plan, we want to know that this is something that we can rely upon when planning the system and when looking to meet reliability.
Thank you, Minesh. I think for a proposal, with such a significant proposal, I think, there should be analysis or data to demonstrate what are the real problems you need to address and, the cost and the benefits associated with the proposal. I think right now it's just a proposal. I don't see any data or the analysis kind of, justify the need for the proposal. Given, already have very stringent bidding rules and other requirements, as I just mentioned, that's adopted, at least for the CPUC low-sub entities. So I just request the CAISO provide some data and, more analysis to justify the proposal. But thank you for addressing my questions.
No, thank you. Thank you, Wayne. As we go through the different sections, I think you'll see some analysis related to the key elements. Go ahead.
Oh, that's okay. And as far as data analysis, that would be a little difficult because we're talking about future way. And so I think the burden is really on providers to say that it's not tightening in the West, because all the evidence, press, everything is demonstrating that things are tightening in the West. I think that's something that's undeniable. And so I think the burden is sort of the opposite, that the burden is on somebody to say that, no, there will be excess capacity in the system in the future. It really isn't tightening. And I think this is a very important point for California, that with tightening conditions in the West and being an import-dependent state and probably going to rely even more so on resources outside the ISO, it's essential that we firm up the capacity and transmission that we rely on month to month to serve our load survey needs. So again, I would put the burden back on the Edison, for example, to demonstrate that it's not tightening.
Okay, operator, if we can go to the next question, there's another one.
Okay, we do have two questions in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Milos, Jason Cox with EDF.
Hi, Jason.
Hey, back on your slide where you were talking about the minimum transmission priority requirements, the monthly not firm, and then must have F7 as the terminal leg into CAISO. If I remember correctly, the transmission priority or the priority for the entire tag is based on the weakest transmission link, not the terminal leg. So, during tight conditions in the West, all you're buying yourself is maybe a few minutes between TLR, like TLR3 going from A to B to, we'll step through those steps pretty quickly. So you're really, your priority for your entire tag is based on the weakest transmission link. So I'm just raising that for awareness.
Fair point. And we'll talk. Fair point. And we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get into the transmission element, and we'll talk a little bit about why we're being a little bit more flexible on those intervening transmission legs. But very good point.
And just questioning how it benefits CAISO to have something that, yes, they have a right to, but they can't get delivered to their area. Anyway, that's it for me.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. We'll move on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. Brian Thaker with Middle River Power. I think my question is a variation of Jason's. Can you help me wrap my head around where the ISO allows a BAA to source RA from a portfolio? How is the ISO going to assess whether there's sufficient transmission of sufficient priority, that would enable it to get to that last 7F leg?
Yeah, hi, Brian. So, once we'll get to, I think the next element of this is the attestation requirement, but for any RA imports that are shown on the supply plan, there's an attestation requirement that the party, the scheduling coordinator submitting that plan, they have to attest that the transmission has been preserved and procured for the delivery of that RA import to the CAISO. Essentially that transmission is in place. So we would expect that to the extent that the party has identified a portfolio of resources within a BA that supports that RA import, we're expecting that they have arranged the transmission from each one of those resources, that they have sufficient transmission to deliver it to the CAISO. So if they have 3 or 4 different resources in a BA, we expect that they have transmission across that BA, minimum monthly non-firm transmission to deliver it to the border of that BA, and then the appropriate transmission from that border all the way to the CAISO. That's what they're attesting to, that they have that transmission in place to deliver that RA import so that we can have that dependability that this import from the time of showing can be delivered to the CAISO.
Okay, so the ISO is relying on an attestation that the controller of this portfolio has affirm that they indeed have the proper transmission from every potential sourcing resource to the ISO delivery point. Okay.
That's right. That's right. And then we'll talk about it a little bit more, but we're also proposing that we're going to be looking at e-tags on which RA imports are delivered. And to the extent that our RA imports are delivered on lower priority transmission, that is something we're going to look into and investigate and potentially refer to DMM for investigation. But we'll get into that once we get into the discrete transmission section.
Okay. Thank you, Milosh. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Move on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hello, Milosh. This is Partha Malvadkar with PG&E.
Hey, Partha.
Yeah, thanks for the discussion. At least I'd be interested in some of your thoughts on a related topic. As a part of the DMM's report on the August and September 2020 events, one of their key recommendations was for CAISO and other balancing areas to review and potentially modify recallability provisions associated with exports. As a part of the CAISO's proposal, as I'm looking at it, is the CAISO is really relying primarily on LSCs and individual parties negotiating attestation agreements for which the CAISO, it sounds like, will review. I was just wondering sort of what progress, if any, the CAISO has made in actually reaching out and working with neighboring BAs to assure that we have, if nothing else, common understanding of what these recallability provisions look like and hopefully comparable treatment between the different BAs.
Thanks, Partha. So some of these discussions will start taking place as part of the summer assessment for 2021. There's a meeting later, stakeholder meeting later today. But one of the elements of that initiative is looking at export priorities and working with other balancing authority areas across the West to understand their practices, what they do, and identify their potential needs for alignment. I think there's going to be then next week as well a stakeholder meeting where some of these BAs are going to share their practices of how they treat exports and under what circumstances do they essentially recall those exports, including potential exports to the CAISO. And I think what you'll see is a common practice that while they have the ability to recall under certain emergency situations, recall some of the capacity, in practice they don't do this. They honor exports outside of their BA to the extent that the issue is driven by a lack of capacity and it's not driven by a transmission constraint. But some of these discussions are starting to take place and will be also taking place later today and then next week when some of these BAs are going to share their practices and experiences. I think from that, then we'll identify is there something that can be done here, any other added coordination, or, you know, is the CAISO's really rules that are maybe lagging behind what the practices of the other BAs?
Yeah, and Milosh, this is John, and thanks for the question, Partha. I think a place that you can find, and we've looked into the different OATs, so the different BAs, and that's a place where you find, as Milosh said, there's a lot of similar and common language around recallability and recall rights in the open access transmission tariffs. That's generally where they reside, those provisions, and they're formally documented in their tariffs. So it's easy, fairly easy. I've looked at several to go to different BAs and look at their OATs and look at their recall, and they're all very similar. And I think your point, Partha, is well taken, that this is a bigger, much bigger issue than, you know, what we are trying to accomplish here. This is a West-wide issue. We're going to be tackling that here in the next couple of weeks and months, I'm sure, as to, you know, how the West deals with recallability. So stay tuned for that. But again, I just want to be clear that that's outside of this effort. So just want to make that point. Thanks.
Oh, no, thank you, John and Milos. That's really helpful context. I look forward to seeing that. And at least I would encourage you all to sort of think about sort of if there's additional changes that might be necessary to this attestation process based on that. I think it'd be worthwhile to sort of consider both of those holistically to ensure that we're getting the reliability benefits that we're paying for and expecting. So, yeah, really look forward to those discussions. So thanks for that.
No, thank you, Parth. And fair point. And once we get to the attestation section, I think we have some modifications in there, and I'll provide a bit of context that do get to some of these aspects of recallability, depending on the, what kind of services the resources supporting RA imports are providing to the host BA. And we'll cover that once we get to the attestation.
Okay, let's move on to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. It's Jeff Spires with PowerX here. Just a couple of comments. Hey, good morning. Just a couple of comments. First of all, just related to the discussion with Partha, I agree. I think, a discussion and a dialogue around curtailment priorities is really important to have, and I think it is a West-wide discussion to have and to consider thoughtfully and try to address some of the issues that the CAISO has faced in a way that's fair and equitable, and I think that's really important. But I don't think that issue replaces the need to take these other steps to ensure up front that someone that sells RA to the CAISO can identify when they make the sale what it is that they're selling. I think that the identification of the source and the associated attestations, including the proposed enhancements that you have on a future slide, are really important. And I just want to emphasize that in our view, these are critical to make sure that the import RA that you're getting is actually supported by capacity that's going to be made available to the CAISO when it's most needed. And so I sort of want to go back to what the discussion was with Wei around the issues of paper capacity and haven't they been addressed. And I think the answer is clearly no. There is a significant problem with paper capacity. It's something that California LSEs are paying for, and they're not getting anything for that payment. They are imports that aren't backed by real physical supply, and not only is that not helping the CAISO BA from a reliability perspective, it's actually adding to the reliability challenges in the CAISO BA. And I think, something, Milos, that you said before resonated with me, which is you're trying to future-proof this issue. We have seen multiple permutations of this type of activity. I think the most clear example that we probably started with a couple of years ago is that some entities are just plain and simple selling what they don't have, submitting a high-price bid and hoping to avoid dispatch. And I think that's the most clear example. But there are other permutations of this type of behavior. Some entities make a forward commitment, even for energy that they don't have on a forward basis, and they just intend to backfill that in the spot market. We now see in the last summer, and I think this goes to the question around looking at data. Well, we look at the data closely, and increasingly it's clear to us that there are multiple marketers out there that are effectively double selling the capacity they have to multiple regions. And an example of that is a marketer makes a forward RA sale to the CAISO and makes a forward sale of physical firm energy to an entity in the Southwest, leaving themselves short. And what happens then is that leaves both the CAISO and the Southwest entity thinking that they've secured the capacity ahead of time, when the reality is that the marketer doesn't have enough to meet both of those obligations. And so what happens when we get to the tight supply days like we saw during the heat wave? Well, one of the things that we're seeing is that it looks like those entities are taking energy potentially from the Northwest, delivering that to the CAISO, say at Cobber Knob, to cover an RA obligation, and then in the very same hours trying to export from the CAISO at a different intertie to meet their commitment to a Southwest entity. And so I think, the point is there will always be entities that are going to be continuing to look for loopholes. It's critical to get this right. I think that it is the time to sort this out. We need to take action now. And, the last point I would make is identifying the resource you're selling at the time you enter the transaction should not be onerous. It should not be costly for any seller that actually has the supply to sell in the first place. I just don't see what the challenge is with being able to say, this is the resource or the system that I am using to make this commitment to the CAISO BA. That is a straightforward solution along with the necessary attestations to make sure that it truly is surplus and hasn't been double committed, that it just seems clear that that is the right step. And so we support the steps you're taking here, and I think it's very critically important to take these steps as soon as possible in advance of summer 2021 because we can't afford another summer like the last one.
Thank you, Jeff.
Okay.
Fair points, good points.
Proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milosh and John. This is Ali Yazdi of Morgan Stanley calling. Thanks for the proposal. I think you guys have done a fair job of trying to balance all the different comments and requirements. I did want to just make a quick comment and potential correction to a comment that Jason from EDF made that I think you agreed with, Milosh, and that was that if you have a non-firm segment on a transmission path, the whole path becomes non-firm. That's just not our experience on BPA. If you've got firm on the last leg on BPA, then all schedules are curtailed pro rata if there's a cut on the southern intertie. So that doesn't matter if you've got non-firm on the network portion. So I did want to make that correction because I think that's an important consideration, especially as you're setting out these minimum requirements, which includes a monthly non-firm service on the network. I think that's going to be too restrictive, and it's going to preclude some transactions. So your slides pointed out that your needs are the greatest in the AH hours or the peak load hours. So I think what that requirement does is, if somebody wants to make a 5-hour peaking sale to a California load serving entity for RA, you're forcing them to buy an entire day's worth of transmission on the network. So it's like a 5-fold increase in transmission costs just to make that sale. And the other unique aspect of the monthly non-firm service in the Northwest is you can't redirect it to any other path. So the supplier can't recoup that cost. So I think it's just going to unnecessarily increase the cost of the import RA product. It's going to preclude certain peaking products from being able to transact in the market. And ultimately, it's just going to cause a windfall for transmission providers outside CAISO that's funded by California ratepayers. So I would like to see more data and analysis on what additional reliability benefits a monthly non-firm requirement on the network leg actually gets you, because I don't think it's that much. And I would encourage you to review with BPA their curtailment practices, because it's our understanding and our experience that if you've got firm on the last leg, that's the leg that matters, and it doesn't matter what the priority is on the network leg. Thank you.
Thanks, Ali. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about these transmission requirements once we get into the transmission section, especially because, while monthly non-firm is the lowest priority, nothing prevents parties from reserving monthly firm service, which has some of the qualities. I think you were mentioning that monthly non-firm doesn't like redirect capability. But we'll talk a little bit more about that once we get to the transmission section. Thank you for those comments.
Okay, let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Dudbo Chignone from Flynn Resource Consultants for CalCCA. Maybe I should wait on my comments. I think it might be more appropriate once you've gone through the subsequent slides.
Okay. No, that sounds good. Yeah, we'll get to the next section is attestation requirement. After that is the transmission requirement, and then we get into the must-offer obligation and some miscellaneous items.
Okay.
If anybody has questions that are discrete to any one of those elements that's not related to the source specification requirement, if you wouldn't mind, just hold your question until we get to that section.
Okay, I will.
Okay. All right, thank you.
We do have another queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Jamie Gannon from the CPUC. I just want to follow back on Edison's comment earlier. I get this is on kind of the jurisdictional question about coordination between the CPUC's rules and the CAISO's proposal here. So I read the proposal as, you know, these are minimum requirements, so the LRA can still set its own requirement. However, the requirement for imports is that currently at the CPUC is that the import mix be paired with a firm energy product that, you know, must fit into the market in a certain way, scheduled in. And so I just think it needs to be clear to parties, because I think it was unclear to myself, if the CPUC's current requirement is compatible with the CAISO's, I guess it's on slide, let's see, slide 30, type 3, non-dynamic resource-specific RA import. Would a firm import product be compatible with that? And if not, then what we might end up with is this other category of resources, which is the non-resource-specific imports, which CPUC is counting for RA requirements because it's paired with a firm energy product, but CAISO is not counting for it. So we might end up with two different counting paradigms here, and I just want to make sure that that is addressed or discussed a little bit more.
Sounds good. Thanks, Jamie. I think, if we're talking about the bidding requirements, I think those are clearly compatible with the proposal because we're ultimately not, these minimum requirements are not setting bidding requirements. So the CPUC could, impose, or other LRAs could impose bidding limitations like those are in place today for RA imports that you must self-schedule during particular hours. I think those are compatible. In terms of the other requirements about those firm products, firm energy products, I think they're compatible so long as those products can identify the source information and meet that attestation requirement. I think that's the caveat here is that they have to be able to identify the source of the generation as well as that attestation requirement that we're going to talk about here next. If they're able to identify that, then I see those firm energy contracts being compatible with these requirements.
Right, but currently there are not products out there today with these characteristics, so those products essentially have to be developed, and it's unclear if they would be developed or could be developed.
Well, they may not be. I think there are products probably that identify sources. I think there are legacy agreements and other arrangements where if the party were to impose those requirements, I think the counterparty could identify it. But I think this is something that we can work through the CPUC process as well. And we're providing, we'll talk about this later, but we're providing kind of a transition period where all of these requirements would become mandatory for RA year 2023. We fully recognize that there may be a need to modify some of the agreements to provide for some of this source information and ensuring that the attestation requirements can be met. So we're providing some time for that, but I would say that there are probably arrangements in place today that can meet those requirements while there are others that currently cannot, and that's where that transition period should allow for contract modification or contract execution that imposes these obligations.
Thank you.
Okay. There are no further questions in the queue at this time.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's go then to the next slide. Let's go to the next slide. There you go. So let's talk about then the attestation requirement, if we can go to the next slide. Okay, so another key element that I think we've been alluding to is an attestation requirement that must be met by these RA imports at the time of submission of the supply plan. So the RA import should be able to meet these requirements. The capacity should be able to comport with these requirements. And I'll talk about a variation that we added here to element 2. We'll go into it a bit more depth, but the first element is that the capacity shown is owned or contractually secured at the time of the showing, whether that's in the monthly or the annual time frame. The second element is the capacity shown has not been sold or otherwise committed to any other party. The third element is that the capacity can only be interrupted for reliability reasons as determined by the host balancing authority area tariff, a transmission curtailment, or a planned outage. And the fourth element is that transmission service of the proper firmness that we'll talk about has been reserved for delivery and support of the RA import to the ISO system. So in the subsequent slides, we're going to go a little bit more in depth into each one of these elements. So let's go to the next slide. So the first two elements of the attestation, that the capacity has been contractually secured and that the capacity has not been committed or otherwise sold to any other parties, those are really intended to ensure that the RA import is committed to the CAISO and that the capacity that's being shown is committed to the CAISO so that we can rely upon it. To the extent that import capacity has been committed to another party, those same 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts have been sold to another party. That would not meet the attestation requirement. Another example is if that same capacity that's being shown for the RA import is committed to our reserve sharing program, that capacity is committed then to another party and that attestation requirement could not be met. And the reason for that is that, the reserve sharing program could call upon that capacity under certain circumstances, and that capacity then would not be available to the CAISO. And it's very likely that, with conditions across the West, it's very likely that the reserve sharing program could call on that capacity at the same time that the CAISO needs it, if we're in certain tight system conditions. Another variable here is if the capacity, the RA import, is also committed to the host BA in providing reserves. That means that host BA could call on that capacity under certain circumstances. And that, again, if that RA import is committed to the host BA for providing reserves, that would not meet this attestation requirement. So the intent really here is that that capacity hasn't been committed elsewhere and is solely dedicated to that LSC and consequently the CAISO, which has contracted it for the duration of the showing. If they've shown it for a month, we expect that that capacity is committed to that entity for that month and to no other uses. So let's go to the next slide. So this is what I've been alluding to. This is a variation or an additional enhancement that we've thought of to in between the posting of the draft final proposal and this presentation. So this enhanced attestation is not currently in the draft final proposal, but we would certainly appreciate your comments, and we would look to put it into the final proposal depending on the stakeholder feedback that we get. It's a variation on element 2, and it's intended to, again, shore up some loopholes that we think were present in that requirement. The intent here is, again, ensure that this capacity that's being shown is committed to the CAISO. So this enhancement looks at, or the way that it would be phrased is that third-party federal supplier to the LSC identified on the plan, or alternatively the LSC where they're the owner of this RA import capacity, they commit that they expect the capacity shown will be available to support delivery of the RA import resource to the CAISO and will not be dependent on securing additional capacity to make it available. So this is really getting to the point that whatever is shown on that plan should not be capacity that is something that they go onto the market within the month potentially to secure that capacity. It should be capacity that is available and committed at the time of the showing. It should not depend upon them going within the month to secure additional capacity to support the RA import. The second addition is that it expects, or the party expects, that the capacity shown will be surplus to the obligations to serve load or meet other commitments in the host BA. So again, this is getting at the element that this capacity that's shown should not also be committed to other uses in the host BA, for example, providing reserves, or is committed to serving load in the BA, or other commitments in that host BA. It should be, again, capacity that this party that is selling it knows is unencumbered by other obligations to the host BA or its own needs. If it's a load-serving entity in another BA that's selling its resource, it ensures that this capacity is not committed to serve its own load in that BA. And then the third element is the original element number 2, that the capacity shown has not, and the element next here, and will not be sold or otherwise committed to any other party other than the LSC identified on the plan. So again, this modification to that element 2 of the attestation is not in the draft final proposal, but we would certainly appreciate your input. It's intended to shore up, again, that obligation that this capacity be made available to the CAISO and nobody else. Okay, let's go to the next slide then. Okay, so the third element of the attestation is that the RA import really should not provide for interruptions other than for reliability reasons, meaning that the seller or the supplier should not be able to interrupt delivery here or not perform at its own discretion or for some other reasons that are not related to reliability. So the reliability reasons, as we noted in the attestation element, could be as determined by under the host BAA's tariff if they take a reliability-based action, such as a curtailment of transmission within its own BA. That's a reason for reasonable reason for interruption. A transmission curtailment across any of the other adjoining transmission systems that it's being delivered to the CAISO, again, that's a permissible interruption, or an outage to the plant that's supporting the RA import, and so they cannot fulfill that obligation to the CAISO. An example here, force majeure provisions are, I think, fairly common in some of these contracts, and a force majeure provision would comport with these requirements because ultimately a force majeure, whether it's a force majeure that occurs as a result of an action or an impact in the host BA, it would result in the BA taking some reliability-based action on that RA import. Could be a curtailment of transmission. Or alternatively, it's a force majeure that impacts the plant itself that supports the RA import. We envision that would result, likely in some kind of an outage. That's how it would demonstrate itself. And so it fits within these reliability-based reasons that are identified in the attestation. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and the fourth and final element of that attestation that we're proposing is related to the transmission arrangements. So this element is really requires that at the time of showing of the RA import on the supply plan, the transmission arrangements be in place to support delivery of that import. And this will provide us, again, with the ability to rely upon this import and know that that import is deliverable at the time of the showing. Waiting until later or allowing the ability to secure transmission, all the way up to real time, but yet showing this RA import in the supply plan poses risk that that import may not be deliverable if that transmission is not available or cannot be secured. So it's important for us, RA is a planning construct. It's important that at the time of the showing, we have the certainty and dependability that these RA imports can be delivered to the CAISO. So to the extent that that RA import is not supported by transmission arrangements, this element would not be met. Now, out of all of these four elements of the attestation requirement, we're noting that the attestation has to be met both at the annual and the monthly time frame. The only exception is that this fourth element related to the transmission acquisition and supporting RA imports, that element only has to be met at the time of the monthly showings. This hopefully provides a little bit of flexibility in that if you're showing the RA import on the annual plan, you don't have to have the transmission, in the annual time frame to support the RA import. But as you get into the monthly showings, we expect that transmission to be secured and supporting the RA import. Let's go to the next slide. So just to touch a little bit on the implementation of this attestation requirement, we're envisioning that the scheduling coordinator submitting the supply plan is the party responsible for meeting this attestation requirement. That scheduling coordinator, we envision they will be the party that's going to be bidding in that RA import into the market, and they're in the best position, we feel, to be aware or work with the supplier to be able to meet these commitments and be able to attest to that this capacity meets these requirements. And like I said, the attestation requirements will be required both at the annual and the monthly time frame. To the extent you have an import identified on the annual plan, you'll be required to attest. And to the extent you have an import on the monthly plan, you'll be required to attest, with the only exception being that fourth element. That fourth element only has to be met, attested to in the monthly showings time frame. From an implementation perspective further, we expect that the attestation, the form that it will take is that there'll be a checkbox in CERA. This is a tool where you're submitting your supply plans, and that checkbox will likely have text associated with it in the form of the attestation, or it will simply point to the tariff section that holds the attestation and say something to the effect that, the party attests that it can meet the requirements in section XYZ of the tariff. But the idea is that this checkbox will represent that attestation, and validations will be in place that to the extent that attestation checkbox is not checked, that CERA would not accept that plan. So that attestation box has to be checked. That party submitting the supply plan has to be able to attest that they meet these requirements prior to submission of that plan. Let's go to the next slide. Let's see if we have another one here or if this is the last of the attestation. Okay. So since we're in the, I think this is the last of this section. Since we're in the attestation section, I thought it would also be good to just cover some of the contractual arrangements supporting RA imports, since there was some discussion of this in prior iterations. And I want to clarify that we're not necessarily identifying one particular type of contract arrangement that can support RA imports over another. Our intent is that RA import contractual arrangements should be able to meet the source specification, attestation, and transmission delivery requirements, regardless of the form that type of arrangement takes place, whether it's a WFPP Schedule C agreement, whether it's a legacy agreement, all of them should meet these requirements in order to be able to provide RA import capacity. So to the extent that parties have legacy agreements that have been in place, for many years, those should be reviewed to make sure that they comport with these requirements, and to the extent that there are any modifications that need to be made, like we'll talk about at the end, there's some time, since we're looking at RA year 2023 as ultimately being the mandatory time frame for implementation, where parties would have time to make any arrangements or adjustments to legacy agreements as well. So I think this ends this attestation section, and let's pause then for questions before going into the transmission arrangements.
Okay, folks, that command once again is pound 2 for questions. We do have some questions in the queue at this time. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. It's Jeff Spires from PowerX again.
Hi, Jeff.
I just wanted to, hi there, just wanted to make a brief comment related to the attestation enhancements back on slide 35. And I think that those are useful clarifications that really help align the attestation with, I think, the intent that you laid out pretty clearly there around making sure that the supply isn't double committed, that it's truly surplus to needs of the source BA, and it'll be available to the CAISO when it's needed. So I think these are useful and helpful in order to make sure that we're addressing all the different scenarios, because, just as an example, you've got some different agreements up on the screen right now. But just to give you another example, there are other contracts that we're aware of where a purchaser, for example, can contract for the output of a resource, but when they do that, as part of that contract, it also comes with an obligation to simultaneously return energy back to the source BA to meet that BA's native load. And in some cases, that return obligation might even be greater than the capability of the resource output itself. And so, in other words, that contract and that entity making that transaction is actually net short of capacity in the source BA. There is no surplus to sell to the CAISO under an RA contract. And so if you don't have the appropriate attestations in place that clarify some of these issues, you do potentially have an outstanding loophole, and I think you can start to anticipate what's going to happen if that type of arrangement gets used to support an RA contract, and then the seller isn't able to find the capacity needed to provide that return energy obligation at the source. I think that's where you get into a situation where under that type of arrangement, the source BA is going to have the authority to cut the export if they don't get the offsetting import. And so really it comes down to, I think, probably the second bullet, or the first one, I've forgotten which one it is, but one of those two addresses that concern by trying to make it clear that this supply does need to be surplus. It can't be contingent on buying some other capacity to replace it. And so, I think that type of clarification is really important here because, like I mentioned before, now's the time to get this right, and now's the time to make sure there aren't loopholes and that the intent of what you're trying to achieve, which we're supportive of, is implemented in a way that eliminates some of those risks of unintended outcomes. So appreciate the clarifications, and we're supportive of them.
Thank you, Jeff. Okay. And Isabella, if you wouldn't mind just going back to maybe, I think it's slide 34, just so folks have it in front of them, the attestation language. Maybe the next one. 34, there you go. Okay, next question, please, if there's anybody else.
Yes, we do have questions in the queue. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Miller, it's Eric Little from Edison. So I'm seeing some difficulties associated with this. Good morning. The difficulty that I'm seeing, I think, maybe on the, no, it's actually this page, sorry. The capacity shown is surplus to its obligations to serve load or meet other commitments in the host BAA. So if I am a merchant generator in some other balancing authority area, how do I know that? And then you couple that with the fact that later on you say it's going to be the scheduling coordinator of the import that's responsible for this attestation. The scheduling coordinator then isn't that seller. We've got a daisy chain of people who don't know whether or not it's excess to that BAA, because most of the BAAs in the West, with the exception of the ISO, they don't have an RA program. They do more like an IRP that says, do I have enough resources to meet load? And if I do, I'm good, and if I don't, then I've got problems. But they don't sit down and specify which resources. They just say in total whether or not they're there. So I'm not sure what process gets you that this is actually excess for the BAA.
Yeah, so let me maybe clarify that element. Is this is not intended to be necessarily a BAA determination that this is capacity that's surplus. This is intended to be an assessment by that supplier that is providing that capacity. The capacity that they're selling to the LSC and the CAISO is surplus to the obligations that LSC has in the host BA. So again, one example is to the extent that same capacity is committed in the host BA to meeting reserves obligation, that supplier would know, and then that capacity should not be shown on the supply plan. Similarly, to the extent that this is, an LSC in that native BA selling its capacity from one of its resources, it's really looking at, does that supplier ultimately, is it access to its needs to serve load or to meet the any commitments that they've made in the host BA. So again, it's not intended to be an assessment from the host BA. It's an assessment by the supplier that this capacity is surplus to its needs and the obligations that they've made, whether to serve load or commitments that they may have made to the host BA.
Okay, well, you guys have a follow-up proposal that makes it clear what other commitments to the host BAA means? Because that's going to become really important. What you just explained helps quite a bit, but that's not what I read from this bullet.
Okay, no, fair point. We'll certainly add that in the final proposal. We'll go into each one of these elements and provide a bit more clarity on what we mean.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Milosh.
Thank you, Art.
Okay, let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Tony Braun for CMUA. My question is, I think, a mechanical one, and it follows up on Eric's question. So I understand that there can be the resource specificity can be a BAA aggregation or other similar sub-aggregation. How does that work with this requirement that it not be otherwise committed in the context of the reserve sharing situation where you have the Northwest Power Pool, for example, and I'm not familiar with the intimate details of that, but I don't think that the reserve sharing obligations and the units committed are bound to that kind of specificity. So how is that going to be sorted out so that you actually know that you can have a resource that's in a BAA that's part of the Northwest Power Pool, have that commitment be in addition to a commitment for RRA to the CAISO?
Yeah, thank you, Tony, for that question. I think, I think in my experience at least, I know that there are specific resources that are committed to the reserve sharing program. So maybe let's start with that case, and then we can go to the more complicated scenario if it's an aggregation of resources or what's committed to a reserve sharing program is some kind of system capacity potentially. But in the scenario where it's a specific resource that's committed to the reserve sharing program, that's something that obviously the supplier would know that a certain amount of capacity from that resource, if it's not the entire resource, is committed to the reserve sharing program. And so that amount of capacity, that same capacity should not be then committed to the CAISO LSC as an RA import. Now, if we go into, an aggregation of resources, what we mean by an aggregation of resources, to give an example, is you could have a supplier choose to support an RA import. Instead of one resource, I'm going to give you 30 megawatts, from these three resources, and they would have to specify, those resources as part of the source specification requirement, which resources are supporting that import. But they would have to then make sure that when they're looking at the attestation requirement, that if they have reserve sharing obligations that these same resources are part of, again, they will have to ensure that that same capacity, those 30 megawatts from across those three resources, are not the capacity that's committed to that reserve sharing program. So the onus is on them to ensure, on that supplier, to ensure that the capacity that they're selling to the LSC is not the same capacity that's supporting the reserve sharing program. And if we look at, you can see on the screen now, slide 35, that element B, they have the onus to ensure that this capacity that they're selling, and then that's being shown, that capacity has not been committed to other obligations. Hasn't been committed to other uses. So they're the ones that have to make that assessment that same capacity, or that from those same three resources, they can meet all of the obligations without having to double self-fund the capacity.
Yeah, my intuition is that the participating reserve sharing BA responds to the request in a reserve sharing when reserve sharing is triggered, right? And so perhaps that intuition is incorrect, but I feel somewhat confident of it. So I mean, that's what I'm having a hard time reconciling, the granularity of this and the specificity of this attestation with what might be happening in the real world.
Yeah, no, fair point. And you know, I think if we take it then to that third element of the, of that definition of the non-dynamic resource-specific RA import, if the commitment to a reserve sharing program is a system, BAA system capacity, again, I think that onus will be on that party to ensure that the capacity that's committed to that hasn't been committed to the LSE as well. So I think, in that scenario, the BAA we would expect, in order to meet these attestation requirements, they would have to ensure that they can meet their obligations to the reserve sharing program while meeting those same obligations to the LSE that they've sold the RA import capacity on.
Yeah, so I understand the concept. I want perhaps as a next step, there might be some robust conversations with Northwest Power Pool, because that's 60-some% of the West here. So if we didn't have a clarity on how this was going to work, then we would be cutting our nose off here, right, with respect to the ability to get imports.
Yeah. No, fair point, Tony. And what we'll do as well as part of, I think, the final proposal is, I'll look into that a bit more to see the nature of those commitments and how those commitments are made to the reserve sharing program, all the way from the individual resource to, if it's a system of resources. And we'll have a little bit of a discussion in the paper on that as well, based on what we find.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Kathleen Colbert from Vistra. How are you doing, Milos?
Good. How are you?
I'm doing well, thanks. Thank you very much for all this information. I appreciated, this is helpful as a refresher, and your presentation at the CPUC's Track 3B Day 2 workshop was really helpful, trying to pump, so I had time to think about this before. I referenced that because I asked a question at that workshop that had to do with the contract itself, the profile associated with the contract, and I believe you and John answered it, but I just wanted to kind of bring it up again, refresh your memory, and make a request that if it's not already, which it may be, and I haven't read the paper in detail, it may already be in the paper, but if not, if you could include it in the final. What I asked was, what is the profile that is required for the contract? Is it the availability assessment hours? Is it peak? Is it peak and off-peak? So essentially, and what I recall you guys saying was it was all hours within the month. I assume it doesn't matter if it's one contract for all hours or multiple contracts, peak and off-peak, but that has to hold a source-specific contract for all hours in the month. And I just think that's a really important detail and wanted to make sure to bring it up again and see if you could include that in the paper.
Yeah, no, sounds good. Thank you, Kathleen. I think we'll get to that when we get to the must-offer obligation. But yes, the intent is that this is a 24/7 obligation. So when you're showing this capacity, there's a must-offer obligation 24/7, and so the contract should be 24/7 capacity.
Okay, great. That's helpful clarification. Thanks, Milos.
Yeah.
To the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, this is Kyle Novice from the Public Advocate's Office. As I'm reading this proposal, it doesn't seem like it quite solves the generator credibility problem because it's not clear how you prove the validity of the attestation. So going back to one of the other examples that was given in the discussion about the generator who commits the same capacity to both CAISO and the Southwest, the LSCs are trusting the generator that the energy will be available even though it's only available to one of those. So that's a bad faith actor that you've described. But the proposal here still seems like it's relying on generators acting in good faith. So it seems like enforcement is really going to be key to making sure this works. So I'm curious, who's going to be responsible for enforcing it, and what penalties are you going to impose if an attestation is reneged on?
Sounds good. No, that's a great question, great point, and I don't think I had it in the slides, but I think it's certainly in the draft final proposal. We're going to be monitoring the different elements of this attestation to make sure that these are met. So if we go through some of these elements, maybe can you go back, Isabella, a couple of slides to the first slide of the attestation that has the 4 elements? One more. There you go. So let's start from the bottom, maybe the 4th element, that the transmission service or proper permit has been reserved for delivery to the CAISO. What we're going to be doing there, and I think I'll talk about this as well in the transmission section, but we're going to be monitoring E-tags from RA imports, and we're going to be flagging E-tags that are delivering RA imports on lower priority transmission than we have specified. To the extent that we do find any, this will be after the fact, to the extent that we do find any that are delivered on lower priority, that is something that we would investigate, and we will likely turn over to DMM for investigation, because ultimately a violation of any of these elements and a violation of the tariff or of the attestation requirement is a violation of the tariff. And that's something that could be investigated by DMM and potentially referred to FERC. So that 4th element, again, we're going to be actively monitoring after the fact, looking at E-tags and flagging any that are delivering lower priority and monitoring that and sending it over to DMM for further investigation. The 3rd element, that the capacity can only be interrupted for reliability reasons, as well as some of the other elements, we're going to be looking at different factors for RA imports, depending on how those are delivered, how those are represented in the market, and we may reach out to some of these stakeholders to the extent we have reason to believe that maybe the capacity shown hasn't been sold or otherwise committed to any other party. And we're going to be looking at potentially bidding behaviors. We're going to be looking at delivery behaviors, non-delivery behaviors. Those are some of the indicators that potentially that could indicate that maybe the capacity is committed elsewhere. And we may reach out to ask some additional questions, or DMM may reach out to ask some additional questions to ensure that, again, that we can be confident that the attestation requirement has been met. So behind the scenes, we're going to be looking at a number of factors that may indicate that some of these elements potentially may have been violated, and if we may reach out with some further questions to see if that is indeed the case or not. But ultimately, if it's determined that there's one of the attestation requirements has not been met and the party has attested to it, that would be a violation of the attestation requirements and consequently the tariff, since these attestation requirements will be in the tariff.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. Tim Cherry, Metropolitan Water District. Question for you. In the set of legacy agreements that you mentioned on page 36, they should be reviewed to ensure the minimum requirements. If you look at those agreements and you put those against slide 32, which is the enhancements to element number 2, if those agreements don't address attestations, would the expectation of the ISO is to try to have the person with the long-term agreement actually do some modifications to that agreement? And what would happen in the case where the counterparty would not want to do that?
I think, go back one slide, I think 35. I think, is that the slide 35 is what you're referring to?
Yeah, slide 35, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think, I think there could be a few ways of addressing that. I think ultimately it comes down to the confidence level. We're not expecting necessarily that you would have, these exact terms in that contract, but ultimately it comes down to those parties being confident that based on the terms of that contract, these requirements can be met. Again, one form is executing that contract and adding some element that the contract or the supplier complies with these elements. But ultimately, to the extent that that supplier did not want to contract with you or modify the contract to meet these requirements, we're envisioning that that would not meet the it would not meet this attestation element, and so it would not be able to provide RA capacity.
Yeah, I think the ISO needs to think a little bit more through that because that could present some problems down the road. So I don't think that's a really solvable solution the way you put it forth.
Okay. Well, maybe if you've got, I think our intent here with these requirements is to, again, ensure that the capacity is committed to the CAISO, and again, that it hasn't violated these elements. If you've got any comments, any thoughts on how you envision this working with legacy agreements and, how do legacy agreements ensure that they can meet these requirements, let us know. But again, at this stage, our intent is to ensure that RA contracts can meet these requirements, whether, again, that's putting in this attestation language in the contract or there's some other way that you ensure that, these requirements are met at the time of the showing. We'll leave it up to you, but again, the intent is that at the time of the showing, you're confident that your contract meets these requirements.
Okay, thanks, Milos.
Appreciate meet this requirement. Yeah.
Thank you.
Let's proceed to the next caller. Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hi, Milos. Jeff Spires from PowerX. I just wanted to make a really brief comment based on an issue that Tony Braun raised earlier around accounting for reserve sharing obligations. And I just wanted to point out that I don't think that is a significant barrier or concern here. And the reason I say that is the focus of these attestations are really on the capacity. And when it comes to reserve sharing groups, those capacity commitments are generally well defined and known by the BA in advance. So, for example, with respect to the Northwest sharing group, my understanding is that generally speaking, the obligation is 3% of generation and 3% of load. And so the BA and or the affiliates that are responsible for managing the supply associated with that system should know what that obligation is ahead of time and should be able to validate and confirm whether or not they've set aside capacity to meet that obligation. And that's sort of separate from whether or not in a particular hour the energy actually gets called upon by the reserve sharing group because somebody has a problem and needs energy. Even if whether or not the energy gets deployed or not in any particular hour is separate from whether or not the BA has properly set aside that predetermined quantity of capacity, and that's really what we're focused on. And so I think that being able to make that attestation and confirm that that responsibility has been accounted for properly is something that the sellers should be able to do, and that would be both if it's an individual resource that has an obligation or if it's a BA that operates on a system basis. I think either way, they know what that obligation is and should be able to accommodate it when they're making their attestation. So I just wanted to make that clarification because I don't see that as being a challenge.
Thank you, Jeff. Isabella, how many more questions we have, or operator, how many more questions we have?
We have one more left.
Okay. Well, let's take one more if it's short because I'm mindful of the time. Go ahead, please.
Caller, your line is unmuted. Please go ahead.
Hey, Milos, it's Eric Little from Edison again. So you said something here that gets me to a kind of pet peeve concern that we've had for a while, and that is it's going to be the scheduling coordinator that's providing this attestation and is responsible for everything that happens before it, and you can refer them to DMM and to FERC for violating the tariff. But this very page 35 says the third-party supplier of this RA is going to provide an attestation to you that everything is okay. and you're then going to provide that on to the ISO, and if it turns out that that's false, you're going to be responsible for that in front of the DMM and FERC. And that is just a situation that is untenable. We can't go down that path. We've already got it in the tariff and spots, and we've been arguing that it ought to be removed, and that there ought to be a relationship between the ISO and the generator directly. I get that for imports you may not always have that relationship, but I don't see a viable way to hold the scheduling coordinator if it's not the generator responsible for the generator or third-party supplier lying to somebody else on another attestation. I don't see that as a workable solution, so just something to consider.
No, I appreciate it, Eric, and maybe, if you've got any suggestions, please note those in your comments. I think one of the ways that we've been thinking about it is the contract between the scheduling coordinator and that supplier that it's representing could potentially address some of those concerns. Like you said, we don't, since the ISO doesn't have a contractual relationship with those import resources. So that's one way that we've seen this work. But if you've got any suggestions on that you'd like to include, please note those in your comments, and we'll certainly consider it.
Okay, so I'd like you to think through the consequences of doing it that way, Milos. So if I, as the scheduling coordinator, the load serving entity, submit to you a contract that says, see, the third-party supplier agreed and attested that that is not committed for some other purpose in their balancing authority area, and everything is good based upon that, even if that turns out to be a lie, then okay. But I need something that gives me that type of assurance, because right now I don't have that. I don't know what it looks like. I'm attesting that I have met all of the requirements that you have in this document, and I can't attest that that has happened because I'm attesting that somebody else has attested, and I don't know whether or not they told the truth. So we really have to figure that out before we're able to do anything on this, because I don't know that there's going to be scheduling coordinators for load serving entities who are willing to accept the attestation from somebody else as being enough for them to attest themselves that everything has been met. So just something to consider.
Okay. No, thank you, Eric. Appreciate it. Okay. Well, we're right at thank you. We're right at noon. I think if we can go maybe 10, 15 more minutes, I think we can get through most of this, and then see what's left. But if everybody's okay with that, let's continue just 10, 15 more minutes and get to these slides. So delivery assurance. Go to the next slide, please, 41. So this is dealing with the transmission requirements necessary to support RA imports. As we've alluded to in some of the background slides, our proposal is that RA imports have to be supported by firm transmission on the last leg to the CAISO, so that's 7F reservation priority transmission, and that any of the intervening transmission legs can be on transmission service as low as monthly non-firm service priority. So it could be monthly non-firm, could be conditional firm service, or could be firm service that supports the RA imports on these upstream transmission systems. And firm service could also be on a monthly duration. That's also 7F priority to the extent the party is unable to or not feel comfortable getting monthly non-firm service. And as we noted yesterday during the UCAP discussion, just wanted to reiterate that here, that if RA imports that are delivered on transmission service that's lower than firm transmission, so conditional firm or monthly non-firm, especially in these upstream systems, if that transmission delivery is curtailed, so if the monthly non-firm or conditional firm is curtailed, it will be treated as an outage and considered for UCAP purposes. But to the extent that you're delivering RA imports on firm transmission and that's curtailed, there will be no UCAP impact. And again, the intent here is to incentivize stakeholders to firm up those deliveries, even on the intervening transmission systems, by getting firm transmission, therefore minimizing the risk of curtailment. And if there's a curtailment of firm transmission, there's no UCAP impact. Let's go to the next slide, please. And this is just an overview of the NERC transmission reservation priorities, which is also a representation of the curtailment priority order. And it ranges all the way from 0 to 7. Firm transmission is 7, 7F, firm point-to-point transmission this is curtailed last. So curtailments usually occur in this ascending priority. You first start with 0 and 1 priority transmission service, which is rare. The more common transmission services are the types that are 2 and above across the different transmission systems. And hourly non-firm service is priority level 2, and so that's usually curtailed first. And then if you need further relief, you curtail into the other service types. Ultimately, getting to 7F service, which is rare since curtailments of the other transmission service types should generally resolve the issue. Now, I will note that some transmission providers offer conditional firm service. This is not necessarily every transmission provider. BPA, for example, offers conditional firm service, which has a level 6 reservation priority, and this is a type of service that is firm for most of the time, except under a few predefined hours or conditions under contract that lower the priority to level 6. So we will accept level 6 CF priority service conditional firm to support the transmission deliveries on intervening systems. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, firm transmission service requirement on the last leg, and these transmission requirements are intended to apply really across all of the transmission systems to all imports, regardless of where they're delivered from. We're particularly focusing in the proposal and in these slides on deliveries from the Northwest, particularly across BPA, because that's where most of the, or a large portion of imports are delivered from or across those systems. But again, this applies to other deliveries from other areas as well. And the reason that we're imposing a 7F priority transmission service requirement on the last leg to the CAISO is looking at particularly the Cobb and Knob interties. Usually on those last legs, on those interties, flows tend, especially in the summer months, flows tend to reach or be very close to the limits of those paths. So it's important that those deliveries be on firm service, because if there's a curtailment, there's a high likelihood of curtailment when flows are near the limit. And so it's important that these deliveries be on the highest priority transmission service to minimize that risk of curtailment and ensure that those imports can be delivered to the CAISO. Let's go to the next slide. So stakeholders that want to look at the different intervening transmission legs, those are in this link on the operating procedures 2510 and 2510A and B. Let's go to the next slide. Sorry, I'm going a little bit quicker to some of these elements. These next two slides are just an indication of general flows across these August days in 2020 on the Cobb and Knob interties, really showing that flows tend to reach the limit or exceed it, and therefore it's important that these deliveries for our imports be on firm transmission to minimize the risk of curtailment. If there's a curtailment, lower likelihood that will impact firm transmission. Let's go to the next slide. One more. So just turning briefly to the monthly non-firm transmission service requirement or higher on the intervening transmission leg. The reason we're providing for a slightly more flexible product here for delivery of RA imports is that we recognize that a network is, there's multiple ways of getting across the network to the desired points, and therefore the flows across the different paths or flow gates may not reach the limits as often as on the interties, so there's a generally lower risk of curtailment across the network. So we're providing a slightly more flexibility in order to hopefully provide more opportunity to reserve transmission service for delivery of RA imports if it's not strictly firm. Let's go to the next slide. And so here the next couple of slides are just indications of flows across a few flow gates on BPA system, really showing that at times they get up to the limit, but most of the time they are below the limit. Let's go to the next slide, show a few more of the flow gates, and the next one. So here, obviously, you can see that flows on this particular flow gate don't tend to reach the limit. So it's a little bit more reasonable of a requirement to require minimum of monthly non-firm service, provide a little bit because even if there's a curtailment, the risk of it getting to monthly non-firm, I think, is lower than on some of the other paths. Go ahead to the next slide. So just briefly wanted to touch, if we don't touch on anything else today, I want to touch on the tagging requirements for RA imports, because this is an element that we're not necessarily, that wasn't in the draft final proposal. But in the draft final proposal, we noted that we're not planning on imposing a tagging deadline requirement because we are requiring that transmission be available at the time of the monthly showing to support the RA import. But after some internal discussions, we thought that it would be beneficial if we could impose a day-ahead tagging requirement for RA import that just shows the transmission profile. If you can go to the next slide, please. Imposing a day-ahead tagging requirement that just focuses on the transmission profile of the delivery of the tag, because that will provide us with visibility against on the day-ahead time frame on what type of transmission RA imports are being delivered on, but it will also provide us some additional operational visibility in that it's going to help support day-ahead planning, both for the balancing authority area and RC West, because we're going to have a little bit more improved interchange forecasting since we can see what type of transmission RA imports hold to the extent ultimately they're going to be delivered. So this day-ahead tagging requirement that we're proposing, and we'd certainly be interested in your comments if you see any concerns or issues with this, is by 3 p.m. on day-ahead is when RA imports should submit a tag with the transmission profile that identifies, again, on what type of transmission the RA import may be delivered on, with ultimately having the ability to adjust those tags closer to real time at T-minus 40 and at T-minus 20 as is current practice. So let's go to the next slide. Let's see if there's anything else here. Well, let me stop at the tagging element, since I think we're getting into some stakeholder comments and issues here. Actually, never mind. We have 5 more minutes. Let's just go through this briefly, and then I think we can pause for questions or defer questions to tomorrow. So in terms of stakeholder concerns, I wanted to highlight one is that stakeholders have noted a concern of the exercise of transmission market power potentially on the Cobb and Knob interties because of the perception that only 2 or 3 entities hold transmission, long-term firm transmission rights on those paths. And the concern was that those entities then could potentially extract high payments for firm transmission service, and those stakeholders, same stakeholders then suggested that in light of that potential for exercise of transmission market power, that non-firm transmission service should be allowed to support RA imports across the interties. Let's go to the next slide. So in the next couple of slides, we're going to show, we're trying to address the concern that only 2 or 3 entities hold long-term firm transmission rights on the interties. And based on our look and work with the other transmission providers who ultimately sell transmission under their oaths on the interties, there are currently 21 different entities that hold yearly firm transmission rights on the Cobb intertie, and 9 different entities that hold those rights on the Knob interties. And this is a mix of load-serving entities and marketers. It's likely that some of these entities are currently supporting and have been supporting with those transmission rights delivery of RA imports. If we can go to the next slide. So here's the look at the Cobb rights of yearly firm transmission rights. And we've broken it up into August and December rights just because some entities hold seasonal rights. But as you can see there's a good, robust number of entities that hold a significant amount of transmission rights, firm transmission rights on a long-term basis on these interties, and they could be potentially counterparties to the extent firm service, long-term firm service, or monthly firm service cannot be acquired from the transmission providers directly. These could be potential counterparties for resale of transmission rights on a monthly or annual time frame to support RA imports, because there's, again, a robust number of entities. Now, we do recognize that some of these, especially the load-serving entities, are utilizing likely those rights to serve their own needs, and marketers as well to meet their own business needs. But I think there is still an opportunity there. The LSCs may not utilize those rights in certain times of the month, so they may be willing to resell it, and marketers as well may be willing to resell some of these rights to the extent, again, you're not already contracting with one of these entities for the delivery of RA imports. That's in the next slide. So that's just to look at the knob entity, slightly less entities holding rights, but nevertheless, there's some opportunity there again for potential resale of transmission rights. Let's go to the next slide. And I think this one is the last slide in this section. But addressing more directly the concern of the exercise of transmission market power, we've noted this before that any concerns with exercise of transmission market power should be addressed with the transmission provider who's ultimately selling those transmission rights under their oaths, or should be raised directly to FERC. These transmission rights across the enterprise have been utilized for years by entities and are valuable to meet other needs. I think it's premature to say potentially that there's exercise of transmission market power for support of IRA imports at this stage prior to implementation. But any of those concerns, if they do materialize, should be raised under the transmission provider oaths or with FERC. And addressing the concern that non-firm transmission should be sufficient to support RA imports on the enterprise, again, we don't agree with that concept. We've shown that flows tend to reach, especially in the enterprise, these are valuable rights that are utilized by parties across the Western interconnection. And flows, especially in the summer months, tend to reach the limits of those paths. So it's important, to the extent non-firm RA imports will deliver on non-firm transmission, those will be first to be curtailed on those paths. So it's important that RA imports be supported by firm transmission, since these are curtailed last and lower risk of curtailment. And I will note that, a strong indicator to transmission providers that there's additional capacity that's needed on the enterprise is requests for long-term firm transmission service. Transmission expansion does not occur as a result of non-firm transmission uses, but it occurs as a result of long-term firm requests for transmission service, because that provides the revenue and duration of service needed to support the expansions of those systems. So, we encourage parties, to the extent that on a long-term basis they're considering supporting RA imports into the CAISO, to request long-term firm service, because again, that provides a signal to the expansion of those paths, and providing added flexibility in the future to support RA imports. So I'm going to pause here, and I think, Isabella, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think we're going to pause here and then defer questions via email, and we may pick this up again tomorrow. Is that the plan, Isabella?
Yes, that's correct. I know we covered a lot of information today, but we are right at now 12:16, and I understand a lot of you will be participating in the market enhancements for summer 2021 readiness call here at 1 o'clock. So we want to make sure that we give you time to eat lunch. So if you could please put your questions in an email to isostakeholderaffairs@caiso.com. That would be great, and we'll work on getting responses back to you. And we do have a full agenda tomorrow, since the must-offer obligation topic will be pushed to tomorrow as well. So we might try to fit in some questions tomorrow, but we do have a full agenda. So if you could put them in an email, we would greatly appreciate that. But tomorrow our call is from 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. It will be the last day of our discussion on the draft final proposal and 6 revised draft proposal. So like I said, we'll try to fit in the must-offer obligation topic, and then we'll be covering the minimum system RA requirement, operationalizing storage, and then backstop capacity procurement. And you can find those meeting details out on the RA Enhancements Initiative webpage, as well as our calendar. So thank you all for participating today, and we look forward to continuing our discussion tomorrow. Thanks.